In this video, I'll show you how to write an entire qualitative honors thesis step by step.
We'll go through each subheading in every chapter, and I'll show you what you need to write for each step with clear examples. You can pause the video after each explanation, write the section, then press play to move on to the next section. This video should be the only video you need to complete an entire first draft of your thesis. You can grab a full thesis template through the link in the description, which you can use to write the thesis. It provides all of the structured subheadings and sentence starters to help you get started with writing each step for the whole thesis. The other quick thing before we get started is whether this thesis structure is appropriate for you. This thesis is appropriate for anyone writing a qualitative thesis. This structure is not the correct structure for mixed methods or quantitative studies. This structure is standard thesis structure and is relevant regardless of the degree you're completing or the country you're in. You can be doing psychology or sociology or anthropology or cultural studies or any range of other degrees, and you could be in any range of countries. You could be in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or anywhere else in the world. As long as you're doing a qualitative thesis, this structure should be a good foundation. With that said, make sure you do double check your program requirements in case they expect any variation from the standard thesis design. Okay, so grab the template that's linked in the description and let's get started with Chapter 1 and Section 1.1, which covers the background of the study. In this section, we're going to write an introduction that looks something like the one on the screen now. The goal of this section is to orient the reader to your topic and demonstrate your focus problem. By the end of this section, the reader should know what the topic is and the problem that your thesis is going to address. So to do this, I recommend doing 3 steps. In the first step, you're introducing the broad topic. The second step, you're explaining why the topic matters. And the third step is setting up the specific research problem. To introduce the broad topic, simply let the reader know what the topic is and highlight why it is important. For example, you could write, over the past number of years, interest in your broad topic has grown due to a reason or trend. If you look at our sample thesis, you see here it says, over the past 5 years, interest in artificial intelligence has grown due to the emergence of large language models in the consumer market. So that's a good opener to a thesis. Step 2 in the background of the study section is to explain why the topic matters. Questions you could ask yourself here are, who does the issue impact? How does the issue affect the world? And why should people care about it? So here's a template. You say, in a specific situation, your topic is important because of a reason. In the sample thesis, you can see it says, in the workforce, the emergence of generative AI is important because it signals dramatic changes to the future of work. Our third step in the background of the study section is to set up your specific problem or research gap. All you need to do is say what the problem is that your thesis will address. Here's a template. It says, this indicates a need for specific, deeper investigation into a specific aspect of the topic. Let's look at how the sample wrote this third step. It says, these developments point to the need for deeper investigation into how generative AI is affecting work in the professions. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first subsection of Chapter 1 called Background of the Study. In this subsection, we named our topic, we explained why it matters, and we set up a specific problem. Section 1.2 outlines the purpose, aims, and research questions for your study. This section goes from broad to focused, where the purpose is a broad statement of why the study is taking place, the aims outline what you are trying to achieve, and the research questions are specific questions that your study will attempt to answer. Differentiating between the purpose, aims, and research questions is a difficult task that a lot of students struggle with, which is why I've set up this AI brainstorming prompt for you that will help you to start formulating your purpose, aims, and research questions in a clear and easy way. I will include the prompt in the email when you download the thesis template so you can have a go at using the prompt to formulate the purpose, aims, and questions for your study. When it comes to research questions, make sure your research question is framed so it will be answered through qualitative, not quantitative methods. A qualitative research question is answered with words, whereas quantitative research questions are answered with numbers. For example, a quantitative research question might ask, what percentage of university students report high stress levels during exam periods? The answer to this question will be numerical. In a qualitative study, the question might be, how did university students describe their experiences of managing academic stress? Here, the answer will be explained in words. Make sure your research question is qualitative, not quantitative in nature, so you can answer it through strategies such as conducting interviews, focus groups, or observations rather than trying to do numerical or statistical studies. Once you've formulated your purpose, aims, and research questions, section 1.2 is quite simple. It simply involves stating the purpose, linking the purpose to your aims, and listing the research questions. So, starting with stating the purpose, you want to outline why the study is taking place. Here's a template. The purpose of this study is to respond to growing concerns about issue. In our thesis sample, section 1.2 starts with, the purpose of this study is to respond to growing concerns about generative AI in the workplace. Moving on to the aims, you want to break down the purpose into 2 to 3 specific aims that you start with phrases such as to explore, to examine, or to investigate. For example, you might say, to achieve its purpose, the study firstly aims to identify, and then insert something you want to identify. In our sample thesis, the first aim is introduced like this. To achieve its purpose, the study firstly aims to identify the specific opportunities and threats that millennials associate with AI in the workplace. Thirdly, we will list our research questions. The research questions ask specific questions that you will answer and should obviously be formulated as questions with question marks at the end. So, for example, research question 1 might be, how do participants' experiences of a problem affect attitudes towards a phenomenon? If you need more help with formulating a research question, I've created a PDF full of research question examples from real theses and templates that you can use to make your own research questions. When you grab the thesis template below, I'll show you where to get it. That's all you need to do for section 1.2. To summarize, you want to state the primary purpose of the study, the aims of the study, and then list the research questions. Section 1.3 covers the significance of the study. Questions you could ask in this section include, why should anyone care about the study? And what value will your work provide for the world? By the end of this section of the video, you should be able to write a piece similar to the sample you see on the screen. When talking about the significance of your study, there are several ways you can conceptualize it. For example, you can think about the practical significance of your study, which refers to how your study's findings might help people. Think about professionals, consumers, or policymakers that this study's findings might be able to help. Social significance refers to how your study might help society. For example, could your study support social justice or social progress? Academic significance refers to how your study's findings might progress academic knowledge, such as by filling research gaps. Contextual significance refers to how your study might help in a specific location or time period, such as whether your study will end up helping people in your local area. You don't need to cover all of these points for significance, but they're good entryways for considering how your study has significance. Again, I do have an AI brainstorming prompt that could help you brainstorm the significance of your specific study. You can grab that prompt as well as the other resources when you download the thesis template in the link in the description. So let's get to writing section 1.3 on the significance of your study. First, you should orient the reader to the section. And secondly, you should outline the study's significance with reference to one or more of the 4 previously mentioned categories of significance. Starting with orienting the reader, you would want to signpost which of these categories of significance we'll discuss in the paragraph, such as practical, social, academic, or contextual contributions. And here's a template you could follow. This study offers a valuable contribution to, and then state the way it will make a contribution. In our example piece, it says, this study offers a valuable contribution to researching the impact on artificial intelligence in the workplace. So, the sample piece presents an academic contribution for its study. After orienting the reader to your contribution, you'll want to explain how your study will make this contribution. Here's a quick brainstorming prompt that you can use to help come up with some ideas for how your study makes a contribution. You can pause the screen now to copy that prompt and enter it into your favorite AI tool such as ChatGPT, and it will help you brainstorm some ideas. Now, let's look at a template. You could write, findings from this study will provide stakeholders with evidence-based strategies for improving an aspect of their life. In our sample piece, it says, findings from this study will provide millennial employees and their employers with evidence-based strategies for addressing the threats and challenges of generative AI in the workplace. You may choose to expand this section by covering multiple points of significance if you can identify several ways your study will be significant. That's it for this section. To summarize, you want a topic sentence that orients the reader to the significance of the study. Then you can highlight your first point of significance, second point of significance, and so on, or however many points of significance you can come up with. Now let's move on to section 1.4, which is the methodology overview. This section will orient the reader to all of your study's key methodological decisions, including the chosen research paradigm, research approach, research design, data sampling method, data collection method, and data analysis method. By the end of this section of the video, your methodology overview will look something like this. This is the hardest part of the introduction, so I'll briefly walk you through all 6 of these methodological decisions that you should have made for writing your thesis. Starting with the broad beliefs encapsulated in your research paradigm and then zooming all the way into the specific data analysis methods at the very end. Each methodological decision is informed by the previous one, which is why we do it in this specific order. We will briefly outline each of these decisions in this introduction section and explain them in more depth in the methodology chapter. Starting with the paradigm, a research paradigm explains your understanding of how we can come to know reality. This will inform how you go about collecting your data. When looking at research paradigms, our options are positivism, interpretivism, constructivism, and critical theory. We can eliminate positivism because it is only for quantitative studies. For this sample, we'll focus on interpretivism because this is the most common research paradigm qualitative research students use. Interpretivism argues that reality is shaped by subjective human experiences and that reality is only knowable through interpretation. As a result, an interpretivist will end up doing a qualitative study exploring perceptions and experiences. For a detailed orientation to all the key paradigms, instructions on how to choose your own paradigm, and cheat sheets about how to write about them, there are additional resources you can access when you download the thesis template from the link in the description. Okay, let's start with writing our orientation to our paradigm. First, you want to state your chosen paradigm, and second, you want to define the paradigm. So here's a template. This study is grounded in, and then name your paradigm, meaning that, and then define your paradigm. In our sample piece, it says, this study is grounded in the interpretivist research paradigm, meaning that the study proceeds from the ontological assumption that research is multiple and shifting, and the epistemological assumption that individuals come to know reality through the lens of their own personal experiences, contexts, and belief systems. Next, we have the research approach. There are 2 research approaches, quantitative, which is focused on broad insights, and qualitative, which is focused on deep insights. The research approach you select is informed by the paradigm that you selected in the previous step. In the previous step, we chose interpretivism, so we're going to be doing a qualitative study. So for your research approach, you can state that you chose to do a qualitative study and explain that you chose a qualitative study because you want deep and detailed insights into perceptions of your phenomenon. Here's a template. This study uses a qualitative approach in order to, and then explain why you're using a qualitative approach. Looking at our sample piece, it says, this study uses a qualitative approach in order to achieve deep, contextualized, and nuanced insights about millennials' perceptions. Thirdly, we want to cover our research design. A research design is a framework for building your study that includes methods, tools, and standards for data collection and analysis. Common types of research designs in qualitative studies include phenomenology, grounded theory, case study, ethnography, participatory action research, and discourse analysis. Hopefully, you already know what your research design is. If not, I do have a bunch of resources on selecting and writing about research designs that you can grab when you download the thesis template. But our sample thesis uses phenomenology, which is the most common research design for a basic interview-based qualitative thesis. The phenomenological research design focuses on understanding how people experience and make sense of a phenomenon. It explores personal meanings and lived experiences and tends to use interview-based methods. So, to outline your chosen research design, you might state the chosen design and then define the research design to give the reader a quick understanding of what it's about. Here's a template. This study uses your chosen research design, which is, and then define the design. In our sample piece, it says, this study uses an interpretive phenomenological design, which is the study of how phenomena are understood and interpreted by individuals in social contexts. Fourthly, we want to orient the reader to our data sampling method. A data sampling method is the method you use to select the data or research participants for your study. To put it simply, how will you choose who or what to interview or observe? Common data sampling methods in qualitative studies are usually purposive, and there are different types of purposive sampling, including convenience, theoretical, snowball, criterion, and maximum variation. Our sample thesis uses criterion sampling, which refers to setting up inclusion and exclusion parameters for selecting who or what to include in the study. This is done prior to going out on your search for research participants. So, to orient people to your data sampling method, you want to state the sampling method and explain how you used it. Here's a template. To recruit research participants, your sampling method was employed, which involved, and then you want to explain your sampling method. Here's how our sample piece did it. To recruit research participants, purposive criterion sampling was employed. This is a sampling method used within qualitative research to identify research participants who would be best able to generate deep insights for answering the research question. The criteria for recruitment was, and then it outlines how the author went about selecting their research participants. The fifth part of the methodological overview gives a brief introduction to your chosen data collection method. The data collection method is a method you use to gather information from the research participants you selected in the previous step. Common data collection methods in qualitative studies include semi-structured interviews, focus groups, observations, and document retrieval. My guess is the majority of people watching this video will have used semi-structured interviews, so let's zoom in on that for this sample. This involves conducting in-depth, one-to-one interviews using open-ended questions to generate data. If you used one of the other methods, or you want an in-depth cheat sheet on what to write about semi-structured interviews, again, I have tons of extra resources that you can grab when you download this thesis template in the link in the description. So here's what to write for your orientation to data collection methods in the methodology overview. First, you want to state your chosen data collection method. And second, you want to briefly explain what you did. So here's a template. Your data collection method was conducted through, and then explain how you did it. In our example piece, it says, semi-structured interviews were conducted with 15 research participants. Semi-structured interviewing had the benefit of generating rich, detailed insights from individuals in relation to the research questions. The last step in the methodology overview is to orient your reader to the data analysis method. The data analysis method is a method you use to analyze your data, usually leading to themes, which you would then discuss in your findings. There are three common types of data analysis methods in qualitative studies. They are reflexive thematic analysis, interpretative phenomenological analysis, and grounded theory coding. Our sample thesis uses interpretative phenomenological analysis because it selected a phenomenological design. Regardless of the type of data analysis method you use, it will generally have a multi-step process for analyzing your data. Here, for example, you can see the steps involved in interpretative phenomenological analysis of interviewed transcripts. If you don't have a detailed insight into your data analysis method yet, that's okay. All you need to do in the introduction is to signpost which method you chose to use. So here's what you would want to write. You'd simply want to state your chosen data analysis method and briefly explain what you did. Here's a template. The data were analyzed using your data analysis method by, and then explain how you did it. So for example, our sample piece says the transcripts from the interviews were then analyzed using interpretative phenomenological analysis. Through this process, themes were constructed from the data. That's it for this section. To summarize, you want to orient the reader to your key methodological decisions, including the research paradigm, research approach, research design, data sampling method, data collection method, and data analysis method. Now let's move on to section 1.5, which covers the scope and delimitations. The scope and delimitations refers to your decisions to include some things in your study while excluding others. Every study has to make decisions about what to include and exclude. This helps to focus your study, but does mean that you won't be able to satisfy every possible question people have about your topic. By acknowledging that you strategically excluded some avenues of inquiry from your study, you're showing that you have thought carefully about your focus of your study and its goals. Your scope and delimitations could cover things like the people or things you included in the study, which we call the population, the settings in which you decided to collect data, the time frame of data collection, and the chosen methodology. For section 1.5, you should outline some points about what you included and excluded from the study. By the end of section 1.5, your piece will look something like the one on screen now. I usually give my students this worksheet to come up with their scope and delimitations. As with all the extra resources, you'll get a chance to grab them when you download the thesis template linked in the description. But for now, let's look at how we can write this scope and delimitations section. Firstly, you want to identify your scope and delimitations, and then you want to acknowledge the implications of these decisions. Starting with identifying your scope and delimitations, you want to state what you included in the scope of your study and what you excluded from the scope of your study. Here's a template. You could start with the study included a population, setting, timeframe, methodology, or something similar, but excluded another population, setting, timeframe, methodology, or something similar. In our sample piece, you can see it says, this study's participants included millennials born between 1981 and 1996, but excluded younger Gen Z and older Gen Y people. Next, you want to acknowledge the implications of your choices. So here, you would write that there may be some missed opportunities caused by your decision, which would be called our downsides. However, you would also highlight that the scope and delimitations decisions allowed you to focus on what's most important to your research question. This is the upside of clearly defining your study's scope and delimitations. Here's a template. You could write, the decision may have caused you to miss out on some opportunities, and you would name these opportunities. However, it helped you to, and then you would state how it helped you answer your research question in greater depth. Let's look at how it's written in our sample piece. It says, such a decision may have excluded potential insights on how people not currently exposed to generative AI tools may have perceived their threats and opportunities. However, overall, the scope and delimitations set at the outset of the study did help to achieve a focused and in-depth analysis. You can repeat these steps for as many inclusion and exclusion criteria that you need to cover to define the scope of your study. To summarize, for section 1.5, you will have named your scope and delimitations and explored negative and positive implications for these decisions. Let's move on to section 1.6, which covers your definition of key terms. These include terms that people may not know, terms that may have contested definitions, or terms that may have complex definitions. Try to focus on terms that are in your research question, as these will be the most important ones to define. Here's an example piece to show what yours should look like when you've finished. To start off with, you want to introduce the term, present 2 to 3 scholarly definitions of the term, paraphrase and discuss the scholarly definitions, and then repeat for any and all key terms. Here's a template. The term, then insert your key term, is a central term in the study. You can see in this sample piece that it says the term millennial is a central term in the study. Step 2 in section 1.6 is to present 2 to 3 scholarly definitions of your term. A good tip here is to go to Google Scholar and, in quotation marks, insert your term, and then after the term write, is defined as. This will find articles that are explicitly defining your key term. Here's a template for this step. One scholarly definition is, and then insert a quote from the definition. Then in the next sentence write, another definition from the literature is, and then you'd insert the second quoted definition. Here's how our sample thesis did it. One scholarly definition is those born between 1981 and 1996. A millennial is also explained by Saraswati as individuals who are familiar and in contact with advanced technology such as smartphones, social media, etc. Step 3 is to paraphrase and discuss the scholarly definitions. Here, bring together the definitions from step 2 into a single paraphrase definition that will be used in your study. This will demonstrate your ability to conduct research and synthesize information from multiple sources. So a template could be, combining the key concepts from the above scholarly definitions, this thesis defines term as, and then insert your own paraphrase definition. So on a sample piece, it says, combining the key concepts from the above scholarly definitions, this thesis defines millennial as, firstly, an individual born between 1981 and 1996, and secondly, an individual raised in an era of mobile technologies and social media. So to summarize, for section 1.6, you want to introduce any key terms, present 2 to 3 scholarly definitions for the key terms, and then create a paraphrase definition for your study. And then you would want to repeat those steps for all the key terms that you want to cover. Lastly, we're going to do section 1.7, which outlines the thesis organization. This section signposts what each chapter of your thesis will discuss. You've already finished chapter 1, so you can start with chapter 2, where you will signpost what the literature review will discuss. From there, signpost what chapter 3, which is the methodology, will discuss. Then signpost chapter 4, which is your findings and analysis chapter. And finally, chapter 5, which is the discussion and conclusion chapter. Simply briefly note what's covered in each chapter. For example, for chapter 2, you might write, chapter 2 presents, and then insert an explanation of what chapter 2 covers. You can see in our sample piece, it says, chapter 2 presents a review of the existing literature on AI in the workplace. It explores key themes such as, and then it lists the key themes that are explored in chapter 2. Similarly, when the sample signposts chapter 3, it says, chapter 3 explores the study's methodological considerations, demonstrating how the study was constructed to effectively answer the research question while upholding research ethics principles. You'd want to repeat a brief outline of all the chapters in the thesis. Once you've done this, you will have completed the entire introduction chapter of your thesis. If you want to see a full copy of the sample thesis that we've been working through in chapter 1, the information on how to get it will be included when you download the thesis template that's linked in the description. Chapter 2 of your thesis is the literature review chapter. A literature review is a summary and evaluation of the relevant existing research on your topic. In this chapter, you will identify key themes and debates within the existing literature and then identify a gap in current knowledge. The gap refers to questions that are yet to be answered by the existing literature. Your study will then answer these questions. This justifies your study by showing how your study will add new knowledge about the topic. There will be 2 steps for constructing your literature review. The first step involves the 4 preparation phases where you gather the literature and identify themes. The second step involves writing up the literature review. In the end, it will look something like the example on the screen. So let's start with the preparation phases. There are 4 preparation phases. In phase 1, you will find academic articles relevant to your topic, save each article citation, and download the article onto your computer. For this phase, the first thing you should do is to create a literature review matrix. You can see the literature review matrix I give to my students on the screen here. If you download the thesis templates in the description, I'll show you how to grab that literature review matrix from me. Okay, so once you've downloaded the literature review matrix, it's time to do a keyword search. This will involve searching academic databases such as your university's online library database or Google Scholar for phrases relevant to your research topic. For example, if your research question was, how do millennials perceive the threats posed by artificial intelligence to their career stability and growth, then your search questions on Google Scholar might be millennials artificial intelligence workforce, or millennials artificial intelligence career, or artificial intelligence workforce threats. Different variations of keywords will come up with different articles on the search results page. So, go to your university database or Google Scholar and conduct your search. For this example, I will use Google Scholar because I know all of you have access to it for free. Once you've done your keyword searches, look on the left-hand side of Google Scholar and you will find a filter to narrow the search to the past 5 or 10 years. Usually, studies into topics that are rapidly changing require a search within the past 5 years, but it's also common to gather literature within the past 10 years as well. That really depends upon the topic you're studying and the expectations of your university program. At this point, Google Scholar will present a range of different sources that you could cite that are relevant to your topic. Try to find sources that you have access to, which will be demonstrated by a PDF or HTML link on the right-hand side of Google Scholar. For those sources, you can generate a citation for the article by clicking the Cite button. That citation can then be placed into the literature review matrix, so you always have easy access to the academic citation whenever you need to cite it in your thesis. Next, you would want to also download the article onto your computer. You can click that PDF link I mentioned earlier to download the article. Save it in a structured format onto an easy-to-access file on your computer so you can remember it in the next phases. Usually, I save it with the author's surname in the citation style that I would usually use when referencing the article in my writing. This makes it easy to find the article when you want it and need it for writing up your thesis. The last step in gathering the literature is finding additional potential sources. You can do that by using Google Scholar's Cited By link. This link presents additional articles that reference the article that you have selected. This can be very useful when you find a highly relevant article. You can find a bunch of other studies that are also highly relevant to your study by clicking that Cited By button. By the end of phase 1, your literature review matrix should be filled with a list of relevant articles that you will then go on to read. You should also have them all saved onto your computer. In preparation phase 2, we're going to fill in that right-hand column that says themes and arguments. This is where we will read our articles and in bullet points, summarize each article's key points that are relevant to your study. Here's what it looks like when it's finished. As with all the other resources, you'll be able to grab that completed sample after you download the thesis template linked in the description. So that's what your goal will be by the end of prep phase 2. First, we're going to manually scan articles for key points. Then, we're going to use an AI-assisted method to double check that we didn't miss any key points. Lastly, we'll identify further snowball sampling opportunities. To step 1, manually scanning for key points, the first thing to do is open each article that you saved onto your computer in the previous preparation phase. Read the article's abstract. The abstract should help show what the key points and arguments are within the article. You may choose to remove some articles from your list after reading the abstracts because they seem irrelevant. For the articles that have relevant abstracts, continue to read the rest of the article. Focus on reading to find the key points rather than reading everything word for word. I usually read the introduction, which will go into more depth than the abstract, but still provide an overall summary of the article's key focus. Then, I'll read the conclusion, which tends to give a clear summary of the key findings. Next, I'll read the discussion section in order to go into even more depth about what the article finds. Fourthly, you might consider reading the literature review section of the article, which can provide valuable insights into the key themes across the literature within your topic area. And finally, you can look over the methodology section. If you take notes on the methodology for every article in your literature review, you may start to identify the main methodologies used across the literature and whether other methodologies are not yet used, which may end up informing your research gap. At this stage, we're trying to take as many notes as possible. We don't yet know what might become a theme, so take notes on any and all relevant key points. Once you've manually scanned the article and taken notes, your literature review matrix should look something like this, where you've got bullet points of key themes and a note on the methodology, and even some key quotes from the articles that you could cite later on when you're writing up the literature review. Now, I'm going to show you a way to use AI to help scan the articles for key points and take additional useful notes. But this should be done to support your manual work and help you check that you understood the article rather than to replace your thinking. And remember that AI does make mistakes and misunderstands things as well, so you're double checking your work here, not letting AI replace your thinking. So here's what to do. First, go to your favorite AI tool. Here I'm using ChatGPT. In ChatGPT, you can press the plus button in the prompt box and click Add Photos and Files. You can then upload the article that you want the AI to read. I've got a useful AI prompt here that will help you to identify how the article is relevant or not relevant to your research question and key themes that it might cover. Here's a sample of the output from this prompt. It will tell you whether or not the article is relevant to your research question, some key arguments and findings within the article, some notes on its methodology, and more key points. You can compare your notes to the AI's notes to make sure that you have come to something of a similar understanding. And lastly, for phase 2, you can identify further opportunities to add additional articles to your literature review by looking at the reference list of the article you're currently reading. Here, additional relevant articles may be listed that you can go on and read as well. By the end of preparation phase 2, you will have completed a literature review matrix like this one, where you've read anywhere between 20 and 50 articles and taken notes on each one. Preparation phase 3 is where you generate themes across the literature. Here, you're going to get your completed literature review matrix and highlight potential themes before clustering the themes together into thematic groups. Let's look at how this is done. Firstly, read through the literature review matrix line by line, identifying any possible themes that could be found across multiple articles in the literature review matrix. Highlight each possible theme in a chosen color. In this way, for example, the first and third sources might both speak about a certain theme that you highlight in blue. Through this process, you're identifying themes that span across multiple articles. Once you have gone through the whole literature review and highlighted possible themes, you can also, again, upload the article to an AI tool such as ChatGPT and ask it to also identify themes to see whether or not your themes are similar to the themes that are identified by the AI tool. I have a really good prompt for this to help you do it. And as you know, you can access the prompt through the link in the description when you download the thesis template. Here's an example of how AI has identified themes that span across the literature from the sample study. The last thing you need to do in preparation phase 3 is order your themes. Now that you have themes, you should look at them to see which one is the broadest theme that is least connected to your study, and then sort them down to the most specific theme. So, the final theme that you will discuss in the literature review is the theme that is most relevant or most closely linked to your chosen topic. With the themes ordered, you can enter the titles of the themes into the second literature review template that I provided called the Thematic Summary Matrix. Here, you can see all the blue highlighted text might be moved into the first theme cluster, while the orange highlighted text will be moved into the second theme cluster, and so on, until all of your themes are grouped together in a logical order in which you would write about them. And here is what it would look like when finished. You can see all of the highlighted text is clustered together into color groups underneath their theme titles. Our final preparation phase is preparation phase 4, where we identify a research gap. A research gap refers to a problem or question that has not been answered by the previous studies. Every thesis needs to identify a research gap and then attempt to answer the research gap through the study. A research gap should be addressed in your research question. So if your current research question doesn't cover the research gap that you identified in the literature review, you may need to update your research questions at this point so that the research gap is included in the question itself. Students tend to find it very difficult to identify a research gap. However, it's not particularly difficult as long as you niche down as much as possible. For example, here are 10 types of research gaps you could try to identify after completing your literature review. The first one is a culture gap, where you study the problem within a distinct cultural group. For example, you could say, what are the ways in which children respond to secure attachment in Asian Canadian culture? Here, you would be differentiating your study from previous studies by looking at the issue from the lens of a particular culture. You could also identify a methodology gap. This is where you study the problem using a methodology that has not been used by previous studies to look at the problem. For example, previous studies might have explored how do children in California perceive South American culture. However, no other study may have done it through photo elicitation interviews, which is a specific type of interview method. The location gap refers to studying how a problem uniquely manifests within your country, region, or even your hometown. For example, a research question could be, how do accident and emergency nurses in Northeast England make sense of their experiences of trauma in the context of recent changes to regional hospital policies? Here, you would be zooming in on a specific location and policies within that location, which will make your study unique. The next type of gap is a time frame gap, where you study the problem within an under-examined time frame. For example, you could say, how were female army nurses' contributions to the Korean War constructed in newspaper reports between June 1950 and July 1953? Next, we have the setting gap, which refers to exploring a problem within a specific type of setting that hasn't yet been examined. For example, this research question asks, how do mid-career autism specialists experience burnout when working within daycare settings? Here, the daycare setting focus differentiates this study from other studies. The theoretical gap refers to looking at a topic from a unique theoretical perspective, such as, how can the lens of strain theory shed new light on working class men's perceptions of crime in Chicago neighborhoods? Next, the age gap refers to studying the experiences of specific age groups that may not have been the focus of previous studies. For example, how do people between the ages of 30 and 35 perceive intergenerational injustice in the context of declining standards of living? Next, the identity gap refers to exploring a problem from the perspective of a specific identity group that may not have been examined before. For example, what are the personal safety challenges faced by young women living on campus at UCLA? Next, the technology gap examines a phenomenon as it relates to a specific type of communication technology, such as, how do teenage girls experience gender socialization through Instagram? Here, previous studies might not have looked specifically at Instagram. And lastly, the profession gap refers to previous studies not having explored an issue within a particular profession. So in our example research question, we have, what challenges do women experience during the transition from college to the workplace in the psychology profession? By looking at these 10 types of gaps, you can always find a research gap no matter what topic you have chosen. And of course, I do have an AI prompt for this as well. You can upload your completed thematic summary matrix to an AI tool such as ChatGPT, and then use the prompt on screen here that you can access when you download the thesis template. And that prompt will help you to identify several different types of research gaps that you could choose from and build upon. That brings us to the end of our preparation phases for the literature review. The preparation phases require that you have sorted your literature into themes and identified a research gap. And once you've done that, we can write up the literature review. In this second section, you're going to turn your literature review matrix into a clean, written literature review chapter, such as the one you can see on screen here. Now let's start with 2.1, the introduction. By the end of section 2.1, you will have written up an introduction that looks something like the one on the screen here. The introduction has 3 steps. Firstly, you will orient the reader to the chapter. Secondly, you will provide a statement of the purpose of your literature review. And thirdly, you will signpost the chapter sections, starting with a clear orientation that says exactly what the chapter will do. This can be nice and straightforward, such as in this template, which reads, "This chapter reviews the relevant literature in relation to," and then insert your topic. In our sample piece, it reads, "This chapter reviews the relevant literature in relation to AI in the workplace." The second step involves presenting a statement of purpose. The purpose of a literature review could include identifying the existing knowledge on a topic, establishing a research gap for the current study, gaining insights and perspectives from experts in the field, and establishing a knowledge foundation for your study. Keep those in mind because you could write about any one of these when we go to our template, which says, "The purpose of this literature review is to," and then state your purpose. In our sample piece, it reads, "The purpose of this review is to establish a knowledge foundation for the study, inform data analysis, and establish a gap in the existing literature that this study addresses." Our third step in the introduction is to signpost the chapter's sections. The subsections for our literature review are the literature review procedure, discussion of themes, and critical analysis of your research gap. So here's a template to signpost those subsections. The chapter begins by outlining the literature review procedure, which involves, and then briefly note your procedure. By the way, the literature review procedure that we'll follow will be outlined in the next step. So if you don't know what your procedure is yet, you'll find out in the next couple of minutes. The template continues. Then the chapter examines key themes from the literature review, which were, then list your key themes. And next, the chapter explores the literature gap, which is, and then you'll name your research gap. In our sample piece, the signposting step looks like this. The chapter begins by outlining the literature review procedure, which involves a narrative review in order to identify key themes within the existing knowledge base. Then the chapter examines the key themes that were identified during the review, which were, and then it lists the key themes. Finally, it says the chapter then evaluates the identified literature gap that this study addresses, which is, and then it outlines the identified literature gap. So that's the end of section 2.1, your introduction. You should have written an orientation, written a statement of purpose for your literature review, and then signpost the chapter sections. Section 2.2 outlines your literature review procedure. This will involve explaining how you conducted the literature review and demonstrating that your literature review was conducted in a way that was high quality and academic rigor. Your written piece will look something like this sample and will involve 3 steps. First, you will name the review type. Second, you will justify the procedure. And third, you will outline exactly what you did for your literature review procedure. So starting with naming the review type, the normal review type for a thesis is a narrative review, which you may also know as a traditional or thematic review. The other major type of literature review is the systematic review. A systematic review selects all relevant studies within a time frame, uses a strict structured methodology, and is designed to be replicable. By contrast, a narrative review exclusively selects the most relevant studies to your specific topic. It highlights key themes across the literature and then identifies a research gap. For more information on the differences between systematic and narrative reviews, including benefits of a narrative review that you may need to discuss in this section, and key studies to cite in this step, you can grab the Literature Review Fast Track cheat sheet. As you know by now, it will be accessible through the link in the description where you download the Literature Review template. So, for naming your review type, here's a template you can follow. The type of review conducted in this chapter is a narrative review, which is, and then you'll define narrative reviewed. Here's what it looks like in our sample. The type of review conducted in this chapter is a narrative review, which is the type of review that is purposeful in selecting important literature for informing a researcher's analysis. The next step is to justify why you chose a narrative review. This would involve explaining the benefits of a narrative review. Here's the template. A narrative review style was chosen because, and then you can explain the benefits of a narrative review. Again, use that fast track cheat sheet if you want a list of strengths and weaknesses of narrative reviews with citations that you can use while writing up this section. In our sample piece, it reads, narrative reviews are particularly useful in research theses because they gather specific details in order to give an overview of what is relevant to the study at hand. The third step in outlining your procedure is actually stating what you did. Here, explain your search procedure by including the search keywords you used, the databases you searched, your inclusion and exclusion criteria. For example, did you include peer-reviewed articles and exclude blog posts? The date range for the studies, and quality control steps such as your choice to read abstracts before selecting articles for inclusion to check to make sure they were relevant to your study. Here's a template. To find relevant literature, the following search databases were used, and then you would name the search databases. Search keywords included, and then you would list the keywords you searched. Only, and then you'd name a specific type of article, was selected for the study. Furthermore, only articles published in, and then a defined time period, such as 10 years, were included in the study. Finally, to ensure only high-quality articles were included, and then state how you manually assessed article quality, such as by reading the abstracts. In total, a specific number of articles were included in the final review. A full outline of the ideal review procedure for a narrative review is provided in the fast-track cheat sheet I mentioned earlier. Here's how the sample piece outlined the procedure. It's quite long, so you can pause the screen if you want to read it. At the end of section 2.2, you will have outlined your review type, justified why you chose that review type, and outlined your specific search procedure. Now we're moving on to section 2.3, which involves discussing the themes you identified when conducting the literature review. You'll want to discuss each theme that is listed in your thematic summary matrix that you created during the preparation phases. When discussing each theme, we will first write an orientation to the theme, then present some example articles within each theme. Next, we'll present specific data or quotes from the articles that you read, and this is done to demonstrate your close reading of the text while also showing key insights from the literature. You may choose to repeat these steps for multiple examples and quotes for each theme. Finally, we'll write a final evaluation of the theme before repeating those steps for every single theme. Let's start with writing your theme orientation. To do this, do not write one study found or according to a specific study. Instead, orient the reader to the overall theme by using language such as several studies identified or numerous authors have highlighted. In this way, you're starting out by discussing a broad theme, not a specific study. Here's a template. The first theme identified from the literature was, and then name your theme. And then you could say, numerous authors have highlighted that, and then you would explain the theme. Remember to cite multiple sources at the end of these steps to show that there are multiple studies that explore that theme. So you can see on our example thesis, it says, the first theme identified from the literature was AI and job displacement. Numerous authors have highlighted that overall job losses are expected to occur as a result of emerging AI technologies, and that this will have a negative impact on the emotional lives of people worldwide. And you can see there that there are 3 citations listed at the end of that text to show that there are multiple studies that talk about the issue. The next step is to provide examples. This is where we can focus in on a specific study and its findings. Now you can start with phrases such as one study found or according to a specific study. Here's a template. For example, specific study argued that, and then explain what an individual study has argued. This study should be an example of a study whose findings or arguments fit within your current theme. Here's how our sample piece did it. For example, Fatima, Petty, and Ashraf posed a strong argument that AI's encroachment on the workforce is speeding up over time, and therefore the threat of job displacement is closer than is perceived. The next step is to present data or a specific quote from within the article to demonstrate you have closely read the text. Here's a template. The authors highlight that, and then insert the quote. And then at the end of the quote, insert a citation. Here's an example from our sample thesis. It says, they highlight that there is currently, quote, lack of alarm, denial, absence of preparedness, and no realistic solution, end quote, insert citation. It's best to discuss multiple examples for each theme, so repeat the examples and quote steps for as many examples as you feel are required to fully flesh out the literature that discusses that theme. As you can see in this screenshot, repeating for multiple studies leads to many paragraphs of discussion per theme. To conclude your discussion of each theme, you need a theme evaluation. Here, the goal is to summarize the theme, analyze any gaps or open questions that studies haven't answered about the theme, and show how the theme is relevant to your research question. Here's how we could do it. In this template, it says overall, and then summarize the theme. Then carry on with no studies within the theme, and then input a gap or open questions you have about the theme. Lastly, the template says, nevertheless, the theme does offer valuable insights into the study, including, and then you can discuss how this study is relevant to your thesis. Here's a completed sample. Overall, the existing literature demonstrates that AI will lead to massive job replacement. While no studies within the theme explore millennials' perceptions of AI in the workplace, this cohort of literature forms a valuable backdrop to the current study, demonstrating a broader landscape of angst within the workplace when it comes to AI at work. Now you've done one theme, you can repeat these steps for every theme. Go to your thematic summary matrix and go through each of the theme clusters. In other words, explore each cluster that is highlighted in the same color and do an entire theme discussion for each cluster, including outline multiple examples and multiple quotes to show that you have depth of knowledge about the theme. That's the end of the theme section. By the end of this section, you should have an orientation, a discussion of multiple examples, data or quotes from each example, and an evaluation of each theme. You'll have repeated those steps for all the themes that you identified in the preparation phases. To read the full sample literature review, you can grab it from the link in the description. Section 2.4 covers our research gap. In this section, the goal is to state that now you know what the existing literature has said, you can identify what hasn't been said yet, and then this will lead on to your statement of how your study will make a contribution to the literature that adds more insights that haven't been explored in previous studies. So this is what it's going to look like once you've finished. And here are our 4 steps for writing the research gap section. Firstly, summarize what has been studied. Secondly, highlight what has not been studied. Thirdly, state the importance of addressing the gap that you identified and state how your study will fill that gap. Starting with summarizing what has been studied, the goal here is to give a baseline before outlining your research gap. To do this, highlight that several things have already been covered by the literature. Here's a template. You could say, the main findings of research in your topic are, and then you'll summarize the themes that you've identified. Here's a completed example. The main findings of research into AI in the workplace indicate that it is a perceived threat, both in regards to the future of jobs and workers' quality of life. Next, highlight what hasn't yet been studied. You'll focus on issues that will naturally lead into your statement of your research gap. Don't forget that you can use the prompt I presented earlier when discussing the 10 types of research gaps in order to come up with a research gap for your study. Here's a template for highlighting what hasn't been studied across the body of literature. No study examined, and then insert a research gap. Furthermore, no studies have, and then you can address any additional research gaps if you have found more than one research gap that you want to answer with your study. And here's our completed example. Across the body of literature, no study exclusively examined millennials' experiences of generative AI at work. Our third step is to state the importance of addressing the research gap. This is where you'll explain why it would be valuable to address this gap within your research. You should already know the value of your importance of your study because you wrote about this in the significance section of the introduction. So refer back to that section if you are struggling to come up with ideas in this step. Here's a template. It's important to address this gap because it'll help too, and then explain the benefit of doing your study. Our example piece reads, importantly, millennials are uniquely exposed to generative AI in the workplace as mid-career professionals. They're in a position where upskilling and pivoting in order to remain relevant might be necessary, and they're still far enough from retirement that they will be exposed to the wave of generative AI. So here, the example is stating why it is important that we fill our research gap, which is an age gap, about getting millennials' insights about the issue. Finally, explain what your study will do to fill the gap. For example, your study could conduct interviews with the under-examined population, or you could focus on a specific under-examined location, and so on. Our template says, this study aims to fill this research gap by, and then you'll explain what your study will do. Our sample piece reads, the study aims to fill the gap in the literature by conducting semi-structured interviews with millennials to examine their unique experiences of generative AI at work. By the end of this research gap section, you should have summarized what has been studied, highlight what hasn't been studied, and stated the importance of addressing the gap, and finally stated how your study will fill the gap. Our final section of the literature review is the conclusion, which will summarize the chapter. Remember, there will be a little repetition here, especially because we just discussed our research gap. That's okay. The conclusion is its own standalone section that should summarize what's been covered throughout the chapter. Here's our completed conclusion sample. Yours should look something like this by the time we're done. There are 3 steps to the conclusion. Firstly, restate your themes. Secondly, situate your study in relation to the literature. And thirdly, transition to the next chapter. So, to restate the themes, simply briefly summarize the themes in an effort to provide a final review of what the chapter has discussed overall. So, a template could be, this literature review has identified several key themes related to your topic. It has highlighted, and then you're going to outline the themes. Here's a completed sample. This literature review has identified several key themes related to AI in the workplace. It has highlighted that AI could threaten to decrease the overall pool of jobs into the future. Step 2 is to situate your study by summarizing how your study has been informed by the literature. This will generally involve restating that your study will attempt to fill one or more research gaps that the literature has yet to cover. Here's a template. This study will build on the existing literature by, and then restate the research gap. And here's our sample. This study will build on the existing literature by specifically examining how millennials experience generative AI at work. And finally, transition to the next chapter. Here, you simply want to foreshadow that the thesis will now transition to a discussion of the methodological choices you made for the study. Here's a template. The next chapter will explore the study's key methodological decisions, including, and then list some subsections of the next chapter to foreshadow what will be covered. Here's a sample. The next chapter will pivot to an explanation of how this study was constructed, including key methodological, ethics, and trustworthiness considerations that were essential for constructing a high-quality academic study. And that's the end of our conclusion section. To summarize, you should have restated your key themes, situated your study by highlighting the research gap that you will fill, and then transitioned to the next chapter, which is our methodology. Chapter 3 of the thesis is the methodology chapter. This chapter explains how your research was conducted in accordance with academic standards so that the results are considered to be of sufficient academic quality. To do this, it justifies the choice of methods and shows how they work to rigorously address the research questions that you have posed. Additionally, this chapter is necessary to help readers assess how trustworthy and ethical your study has been. We'll keep working off the sample piece that you can grab in the link in the description. So let's get started with the introduction. The introduction outlines the chapter purpose and signposts the chapter structure. When talking about the chapter purpose, you can consider 3 purposes. One is to ensure the study is of high academic quality. Another is to allow others to evaluate the study's quality. And the third is to demonstrate the trustworthiness and integrity of the study. So here's a template. The chapter explains the study's methodology, which is designed to, and then state the chapter's purpose. The example says, this chapter explains the methodological decisions that underpin the study. The purpose of this chapter is to transparently present how the study was undertaken in order to demonstrate academic quality, ethics, and trustworthiness. The second part of the introduction is to signpost the chapter's structure. Using a typical signposting structure such as, first the chapter will, second the chapter will, and third the chapter will. Here's a template. The chapter begins by, and then insert the first section. It then explores the second section, then the third section, and so on. There are 14 subsections in the methodology, so often you can bunch them together as with our sample piece, which says, the subsections in this chapter are structured to explain the higher order decisions, including the study's paradigm, approach, and design, and how they filter down to inform the practical tasks of data sampling, collection, and analysis. Next, the chapter explores the study's ethical considerations and how research participants were protected from potential harm. Finally, the trustworthiness and reflexivity considerations are presented.
That brings us to the end of section 3.1, the introduction. In this section, you should have outlined the chapter's purpose and signpost the chapter's structure.
Now we'll move on to section 3.2, which is the purpose, aims, and research questions. You'll recognize this section because you've already written a section very similar to this in the introduction. It's okay that section 3.2 does overlap significantly with section 1.2. This is a natural place to reintroduce your study's purpose, aims, and research questions, because the rest of this whole chapter is designed to help address the research questions that you're about to state. For a quick recap, the purpose of your study refers to a broad statement of why the study is taking place. The study's aims will be statements of what you are trying to achieve, and the research questions are specific questions that your study will answer. Remember, you do have that brainstorming prompt that you can use to come up with the purpose, aims, and questions for your study. If you've already written section 1.2, you can go back to that and make sure the purpose, aims, and research questions that you are about to write are consistent with what you wrote in chapter 1. Here's what to write. Firstly, you want to write the study's purpose, aims, and research questions. And then secondly, you will link the research questions to the research design discussion that is coming up. Starting with stating the purpose, aims, and research questions, this is exactly the same as section 1.2, where you directly state the purpose of your study, follow up with a statement of the study's aims that could be anywhere between 1 and 4 aims, and then close by listing out your research questions, which are usually between 1 and 3 questions. Here's a template. The purpose of this study is, and then insert the purpose. Specifically, the aims of this thesis are, and then you will list as many aims as you have. And then lastly, to achieve these aims, the following research questions are pursued, and then list the research questions. Often, the research questions are listed in bullet points. Here's a sample piece. You can pause the screen and read this if you like, but you should be familiar with how to do this already because, as I said, you've already done this exact style in section 1.2. The second part of section 3.2 is to link the research questions to the upcoming research design. Here, you need to explain that your research questions shape the methodological choices that are coming up in the chapter. So, for example, your research questions should be formulated in a qualitative way where they aim to understand perceptions, meanings, and understandings, and that is going to inform the fact that you're going to be doing qualitative methods that will be discussed throughout this chapter. Here's a template of what you could write. This study employed qualitative methods because they are well equipped to explore, and then paraphrase the research aims and questions to finish that sentence. In our example piece, it reads, the remainder of this chapter demonstrates how an interpretive qualitative methodology and related methods were chosen specifically to answer the above research questions about millennials' experiences and meanings.
That brings us to the end of section 3.2, the purpose, aims, and research questions. In this section, you should have stated the study's purpose, aims, and research questions, and linked the research questions to the research design.
Section 3.3 through to section 3.9 all explain the various methodological choices that you made. As we discussed in the introduction, these include the paradigm, research approach, research design, research setting, research sampling methods, data collection methods, and data analysis methods. And remember, we start broad with the paradigm, and each subsequent decision is informed by the previous decision, which is why we do it in this exact order. If you don't yet know your paradigm, approach, design, sampling method, data collection method, or data analysis method, you can use one of my fast-track thesis roadmaps that have all of these decisions mapped out for you in advance,
And as you know by now, you can grab them through the additional resources that you can find when you download the thesis template via the link in the description. Okay, let's look at how to write sections 3.3 to 3.9. We're going to go into more depth on each of these decisions in this chapter than we did in chapter 1. So we'll start at 3.3, which explains your chosen paradigm. A research paradigm is a worldview that shapes your assumptions about your research. Research paradigms are composed of an ontology, which explains the paradigm's beliefs about reality, and an epistemology, which explains the paradigm's beliefs about knowledge, or in other words, how can we come to know reality? There are 4 common research paradigms. These are positivism, interpretivism, constructivism, and critical theory. Note that there are more paradigms than this, but these 4 make up the vast majority of paradigms that students will follow for their thesis. The first paradigm is positivism. Your thesis will not be positivist, as positivism is used for quantitative studies. But all qualitative studies are a reaction to positivism. So you do need to understand what positivism is. So to understand positivism, the first thing you need to know is that it is the historically dominant paradigm, which means it has been used in the vast majority of studies in academic contexts. Its ontology is a belief that reality is unchanging and exists independently of the human mind. As a result, it believes that we can use scientific instruments to come to know a single true and stable reality. Next, we have interpretivism and constructivism. These two are related paradigms, and broadly, they have shared understandings of the world. They both aim to explore people's beliefs about reality using qualitative methods such as interviewing. Their shared ontology is that reality is socially constructed, and their shared epistemology is they believe people come to know reality through experience and social interaction. Interpretivism is usually the default paradigm for research students who are conducting qualitative research. However, some research designs explicitly frame themselves as constructivist. In general, I recommend to my students to use interpretivism as their paradigm unless they've chosen a research design that explicitly claims to be constructivist. One example is a branch of grounded theory called constructivist grounded theory. If you use my pre-made research roadmaps I mentioned earlier that are included in the additional resources, you'll be able to see examples of designs that are explicitly constructivist or even social constructivist as opposed to the default interpretivist choice. Our other common research paradigm is critical theory. Critical theory's ontology is that people in power shape the world to oppress the powerless. Its epistemology is that knowledge is shaped by oppressor-oppressed relations. Critical theory is commonly used in critical discourse analysis designs. I have full detailed outlines of all of these paradigms, including critical theory, in the fast track cheat sheets, and you know where you can get them. Okay, with that brief orientation out of the way, we're going to explore how to write the paradigm section. Firstly, you will start section 3.3 by defining the term research paradigm, then introducing your chosen research paradigm. Here's a template. A research paradigm is, and then insert your definition. One key paradigm is, and then insert the paradigm that you've chosen, which believes, and then briefly define that chosen paradigm. Here's a sample. A research paradigm is an overarching worldview that shapes a research project. It is defined as beliefs and assumptions about the world that shape and guide the researcher's approach to data and analysis. This study's paradigm is interpretivism, which argues that each individual has their own perceptions of reality and therefore researchers should study research participants' interpretations of events and phenomena. The next step is to outline the ontological assumptions of your chosen paradigm. To do this, define the term ontology and then define your own paradigm's ontological assumptions. Here's a template. Each paradigm contains an ontological stance. Ontology can be defined as, and then insert a paraphrased definition of the concept of ontology.
Then carry on with the ontological assumptions of your paradigm are, and then explain your paradigm's ontology. Here's an example. Each paradigm contains an ontological stance. Ontology can be defined as the study of nature of reality. It is concerned with whether reality is external to the individual or shaped by it. The ontological assumption of interpretivism is that reality is multiple and a product of individual collective thoughts. The next step will be to outline your epistemological assumptions. So you would need to define the term epistemology and then define your paradigm's epistemological assumptions. Here's a template. Each paradigm also contains an epistemological stance. Epistemology can be defined as, and then insert a paraphrase definition of the concept of epistemology. And then carry on with the epistemological assumptions of your paradigm are, and then you will explain your paradigm's epistemology. Here's a sample. Similarly, each paradigm contains an epistemological stance. Epistemology can be defined as how people come to know and acquire reality. Interpretivism holds that knowledge of reality is constructed in the mind, and therefore, interpretivists turn their attention to understanding subjective meanings and experiences. Next, justify your choices. Here is where you explain why you chose your paradigm. For example, an interpretivist paradigm is an ideal paradigm when constructing in-depth research into people's perceptions. Here's a template. Adopting the stance of, and then insert your paradigm, is consistent with the study's focus on perceptions or experiences of your specific phenomenon. Here's a sample. An interpretivist stance has been selected for this study as it underpins the study's concern with the perceptions, meaning-making, and experiences of millennials in the workplace.
That brings us to the end of section 3.3, the research paradigm. In this section, you should have outlined your paradigm, outlined your ontological assumptions, outlined your epistemological assumptions, and justified your choices.
Now we'll move on to section 3.4, which is your research approach. As you can see in this image, we're moving down from paradigm to approach, where the approach is situated within the paradigm. A research approach is either qualitative or quantitative, and we will of course be using a qualitative approach. You will need to be able to explain and defend why you chose a qualitative approach. First, we'll compare qualitative and quantitative research. Then we will state your approach, which is qualitative, explore its benefits, explore its downsides, and justify why you chose to do qualitative research. So let's start with writing the comparison. Here's the difference. Quantitative research uses scientific instruments to identify an objective truth. It attempts to identify broad trends and provides broad but shallow understandings of the world. By contrast, qualitative research uses the researcher to explore perspectives and interpretations. It attempts to explore specific situations in order to provide deep but narrow insights. We do have a fast-track cheat sheet that compares qualitative and quantitative research, which will give you detailed strengths and weaknesses of each. You know where to get it. Okay, so here's the template for writing up the comparison. Quantitative research is, and then define and explain quantitative research. On the other hand, qualitative research is, and then define and explain qualitative research. Here's a sample. Quantitative research flows from positivism and is concerned with objectively measuring reality. Qualitative research, on the other hand, follows from interpretivism and is focused on generating in-depth insights rather than generalizability. It examines the topic in context, giving a holistic understanding. Step 2 is to state your approach. Here, all you need to do is state that you're using a qualitative approach because you want to achieve an in-depth explanation. Here's a template. This study adopted a qualitative approach because, and then give your reason. Our sample reads, given that this study is interpretivist, a qualitative approach is most appropriate. Step 3 is to explore the benefits of qualitative research. Here are 2 benefits. One could be that qualitative research can help us understand complex issues that can't be measured using quantitative methods. Benefit number two is you can capture rich and contextualized details about the topic you're studying. As you know, you can find more benefits and weaknesses in the Fast Track cheat sheet. So here's a template. The benefits of using a qualitative approach include benefit 1, benefit 2, and benefit 3. Here's a sample. One key benefit of using a qualitative approach is its focus on research participants' voices. Further, it seeks to generate explanations of human experiences that cannot be achieved through quantifiable studies. Next, explore some downsides of your choice. Two downsides are that qualitative research does not lead to generalizable findings, and that qualitative research cannot predict future outcomes. Here's a template. The downsides of using a qualitative approach include downside 1, downside 2, and downside 3. Here's a sample. However, the qualitative approach does have limitations, including limited generalizability and susceptibility to researcher bias. Lastly, justify your choice. Here are two possible justifications. One could be that a qualitative approach makes most sense for a study like yours that seeks deep insights. Another justification could be that few previous studies have used a qualitative approach to examine your topic or problem in depth. Here's a template. Overall, the qualitative approach was determined to be best for this study because, and then insert your justification. Here's an example. On balance, the most effective approach for addressing how millennials experience and make meaning of AI in the workplace was determined to be the qualitative approach. It was determined to be highly suitable for a study concerned with experiences and perceptions and would be best for answering the research question directly. That brings us to the end of section 3.4, the research approach. In this section, you should have compared qualitative and quantitative research, stated that your approach is qualitative, explored the benefits of a qualitative approach, explored the downsides of a qualitative approach, and justified your choice. Section 3.5 explains your study's research design. A research design is an overall plan for how a study will be conducted and is the most influential factor in shaping how you will proceed with your study. Your research design is nested underneath the approach and paradigm, so it needs to be consistent with both a qualitative approach and the research paradigm that you selected. There are 6 common research designs in qualitative research, including phenomenology, grounded theory, case study, ethnography, participatory action research, and discourse analysis. All of these are explained in depth in my Fast Track cheat sheets, but here I'll go into a little bit of detail about each one so you have a general overview of the common research designs. First is phenomenology. Phenomenology examines a phenomenon by exploring how individuals experience it and make meaning of it. Phenomenology is versatile and can be used for most qualitative methods, including if you are using interviews or observations for data collection. Phenomenology is the most common design used by undergraduate students who use semi-structured interviews in a research project, which makes up about 80% of students. Strengths of phenomenology include that it senses participants' voices, provides deep insights, and is useful for examining complex issues. However, it does have several weaknesses. One potential weakness is the risk of researcher bias, because the researcher is actively interpreting the data through a process called hermeneutics. Another weakness is that phenomenological research does not produce generalizable results because it is inherently qualitative in nature. Next is grounded theory. This would be the second most common qualitative research design. This design tries to develop a theory about a topic by approaching it without preconceived notions or ideas. It tries to keep an open mind about the topic and not let existing literature or theories affect the data analysis process. In other words, it is a highly inductive approach to research. It can be used for most qualitative data collection methods, including interviewing, observations, and focus groups.
One strength of grounded theory is that it is a data-driven approach, with a strong focus on analyzing data within a study without the influence of past literature or the prior assumptions of the researcher. Another strength is that it provides deep insights into a topic. One weakness is that it can become confusing as you don't really have a clear end goal to work towards, unlike other designs like phenomenology. Another weakness is that it's often criticized for trying to assume that the researcher is an objective bystander. Next is the case study design. A case study is a design that focuses only on a single specific person, place, or event due to its revealing nature. This design often uses a combination of data collection methods, usually including interviews and observations, and potentially also document analysis. Strengths of case studies include that they give very detailed insights into a specific interesting case. They tend to also give strong insights into real-life situations. However, with very few research participants, the results of case studies are not generalizable. Next is ethnography. Ethnography involves the researcher embedding themselves in an environment for a long period of time to develop deep insights. For example, a researcher might live within a community for 6 months to observe them and take notes. They may also interview people whilst in the field. A strength of ethnography is that it gives extremely detailed descriptions and explanations of a phenomenon or cultural group, and can provide strong culturally sensitive insights. However, weaknesses include that the researcher often becomes part of the group that they are observing, leading to potential insider bias. Furthermore, during observations, the presence of the researcher can influence the behaviors of the people they are observing. A practical weakness of this approach is that it is extremely time-consuming, and therefore people conducting short university studies often don't have the scope to conduct sustained observations. The next is participatory action research. Participatory action research involves the researcher exploring their own professional practice through a range of research cycles where they attempt to improve their professional practice during each cycle. This design is commonly used in education studies by practicing teachers who are completing their master's degree. Strengths of this design include that the results are very actionable because the researcher is applying their insights throughout their process to improve practice. Furthermore, this is clearly an impactful approach because it is directly improving the researcher's practice throughout the process. A weakness is that the researcher is also a participant in their own study, which can cause confusion during the research process. Lastly, we have discourse analysis. This involves exploring how the use of language shapes knowledge and understandings about a topic. This is generally used for analyzing text, such as books, movies, television advertisements, policy documents, and so on. Strengths include that this method reveals power dynamics inherent in language and can highlight and challenge our underlying assumptions that we're not aware of. Another practical strength is that data collection for this method is very easy. You don't have to seek out and organize research sessions with real human research participants. Instead, you can simply gather the texts and start analyzing them immediately. A weakness of this approach is the requirement for specialized knowledge, especially around concepts within linguistic analysis and semiotics. If you do choose to follow a discourse analysis approach, I'd recommend grabbing my fast track cheat sheets on discourse analysis that will help walk you through the processes of using linguistic and semiotic tools to analyze texts. I have fast track cheat sheets for all of the research designs discussed here that you can grab when you follow the link in the description. So let's look at how to write this section. The first step is to state your chosen research design. Next, state the purpose of the research design, describe its benefits, critically analyze the design, which includes looking at its limitations, and justify why you chose your specific design. Start by simply and clearly stating and defining your chosen research design. Here's a template. This study employs, and then name your research design, and then continue with this design is, and then define it. Here's an example. This study employs hermeneutic phenomenology as its research design. Phenomenology is a research design that aims to focus on experiences and perceptions of a phenomenon. Next, state the purpose of the research design. For example, the purpose of a case study design would be to generate detailed insights into a particularly revealing or unique instance of a phenomenon. Here's a template. In your research design, the purpose is to, and then explain the purpose. Here's a sample. In this research design, the purpose is to censor research participants' experiences. Next, describe your design's benefits. I've briefly discussed some of the benefits of each of the designs in this video, or you can use their fast-track cheat sheets, which go into far more depth about each design's benefits and provide relevant references that you can cite. As an example, a key benefit of the case study design is the ability to generate very deep insights that have clear benefits to a specific, interesting, or revealing case. Here's a template. This design has a benefit of, and then name the benefit. In the example piece, it says, the benefit of this design is that it centers the research participant in a study, focusing on how each individual participant constructs reality through conscious thought and interpretation of their experiences. The next step is to critically analyze your chosen design. Again, earlier I mentioned some limitations of each research design, or you can use the fast-track cheat sheets where I present limitations and critiques of each design in significant detail, and I'll also provide references you can cite. Here's a template. Despite its benefits, your research design has a downside of, and then name the downside. Here's a sample. Despite its benefits, hermeneutic phenomenology has the downside of being highly interpretive. The role of the researcher is centralized, which means a phenomenological study can be accused of subjectivity and bias. Lastly, justify your choice. Explain why you think your chosen design is an ideal design for your specific study. Here's a template. Overall, your research design was selected for this study because, and then state your final evaluation of the benefit of the design to your study. Here's an example. Overall, hermeneutic phenomenology was selected for this study because it was considered consistent with the interpretivist paradigm that underpins the study. Further, it provides tools through Smith's hermeneutic interpretative phenomenological analysis approach to data analysis to achieve a deep reading of research participants' responses to interview questions. That brings us to the end of section 3.5, the research design. In this section, you should have stated your research design, stated the purpose of the research design, described its benefits, critically analyzed the research design, such as exploring some of its downsides, and justified your choice. Section 3.6 is where you will outline the setting. If your study takes place in a specific setting or context, you will need to explain the setting so your reader understands how the setting influenced the study. This step is an optional step and is usually only used if the setting is a relevant aspect of the study, such as in case studies or an ethnography. You should describe the setting in enough detail that the reader can compare it to their own setting and understand how the setting in your study was a fundamental aspect of the study itself. For this, there are two steps. First, name and describe the setting, and then explain why the setting was chosen. When naming and describing the setting, you could explain the location and environment, such as whether it's urban or rural. You could also explain the social and cultural context of the environment, such as whether or not it has certain behavioral norms that make it particularly interesting and worthy of study. Or you could outline the population characteristics within the setting, such as whether the setting has a large number of low-income families, immigrant communities, adult learners, multicultural groups, homogeneous groups, etc. Here's an example. This study setting was, and then explain what the setting was, such as a certain classroom, school, hospital, or so on. Then continue with key features the setting include, and then outline some key features. Here's the sample. This study setting was a grade 3 classroom in Seattle, Washington. A key feature of this classroom was that it had a high number of children diagnosed with autism. Next, explain why the setting was chosen. Here are some potential explanations. It was relevant to the research question, it gave you access to information-rich cases, or it was a unique environment worthy of study. Here's a template. This setting was chosen for the study because, and then explain the setting's relevance or value. Here's an example. This setting was chosen for the study because it represented a high-intensity teaching environment where the demands of inclusive education intersect with the specific challenges of supporting students with autism. That brings us to the end of section 3.6, the research setting. In this section, you should have named and described the setting and explain why the setting was chosen for the study. Section 3.7 outlines your data sampling methods. In this section, explain how you ended up finding research participants or data sets to study. We will look at 7 specific data sampling methods that are common in qualitative research before I show you how to write about them. As usual, you can get fast-track cheat sheets with all the information you need to write about each data sampling method, as well as sources to cite, linked in the description. Starting with purposive sampling. Purposive sampling involves selecting research participants based upon their knowledge or experience related to the research question. In other words, instead of selecting random people, the researcher will select people who will best help them answer the research question. Strengths of this approach include that research participants are all capable of giving relevant insights into the topic because they were specifically selected due to their knowledge of the topic, and that this is an effective way to find answers to qualitative research questions. Weaknesses include that this sample is not representative of the broader population, which is a general weakness of qualitative research. And it is often hard to find enough research participants who meet your inclusion and exclusion criteria of a purposive sample. The remaining sampling methods are subcategories of purposive sampling that you may choose. One is snowball sampling. Snowball sampling starts with 1 or 2 research participants, and those research participants refer you to additional relevant research participants who they personally know. This approach is very useful when working with hard-to-find or marginalized groups. In these situations, the researcher only needs to find one relevant person from the population group who can refer the researcher on to more people who the researcher would not have been able to find otherwise. A weakness of this approach is that you're reliant on your research participants for referrals, which usually means there isn't a strong inclusion or exclusion criteria structuring your choice of who to include in the study. Convenience sampling involves selecting participants based on how easily you can find them. I do not recommend convenience sampling because it is considered to be a low credibility approach. Criterion sampling is a purposive sampling method where participants are selected based on whether or not they meet a specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. Strengths of criterion sampling include that it ensures all research participants are relevant to the study and helps to increase the trustworthiness of your research. But a weakness is that you may accidentally exclude interesting cases if you set your inclusion criteria to be too strict, thereby excluding people who would otherwise have been useful to include in the study. Maximum variation sampling involves finding research participants across a broad spectrum to capture as many perspectives as possible. For example, a researcher may choose people of various different racial, ethnic, gender, and cultural backgrounds in order to get the maximum possible range of insights. A strength of this method is that it can generate very interesting and broad insights leading to rich data. However, some participants may not be relevant to your study, which could dilute the focus of the study. Theoretical sampling is a specific approach used only in grounded theory, where the researcher selects research participants on a rolling and ongoing basis as they analyze the data. This allows the researcher to bring in new research participants late in the data analysis process so they can gather as much data as needed until a theory has been generated. To learn more about theoretical sampling, I'd recommend looking at my grounded theory resources that you can get when you download the thesis template. Lastly, we have case study specific sampling methods, which can include extreme and deviant case sampling, typical case sampling, critical case sampling, and revelatory case sampling. Again, to learn about the specific case study specific methods, visit my case study resources linked in the description. Now, let's look at how you will write up your sampling section. First, explain the participant group. Second, explain the sampling method. Third, justify the sampling method. Fourth, set an inclusion-exclusion criteria. Fifth, explain your recruitment procedure. And sixth, justify the sample size. To explain the participant group, outline the defining features of the participants or the dataset if you're using document analysis. For example, what is the profession, age, gender, etc. of the people you are interviewing, observing, or having participate in your focus groups? Here's a template. The research participants for this study were, and then explain the research participants. Here's a sample. The research participants for this study were millennial professionals. Then you will explain the sampling method. For this step, simply name your chosen sampling method, then explain and define it. Here's a template. Participants were selected through, and then name the sampling method, which is, and then define the sampling method. Here's a sample. Participants were selected through purposive criterion sampling, which is a qualitative sampling method that focuses on selecting research participants that would be best suited to answer the research question. Next, justify the sampling method. Here, state the benefits of the sampling method for your study, demonstrating that the sampling method will help you to achieve the goal of answering the research question. Here's a template. The sampling method was selected because, and then name a benefit or state the suitability for your study. Here's an example. This study's intent was to generate deep contextualized insights rather than generalizable findings. As such, the chosen sampling method was considered to be ideal for this qualitative study. The next step is outlining the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Here, explain the factors that determine the people or text that you included, as well as the people or text that you excluded from the study. Here's the template. Selection criteria for the study included inclusion criteria 1, inclusion criteria 2, exclusion criteria 1, and exclusion criteria 2. Here's a sample. Inclusion criteria for participants included their age, born between 1981 and 1996, and employment status, currently employed. A third self-selection criteria for participants was that they had knowingly used or been exposed to generative AI in their workplace. The next step is to outline the recruitment procedure. Here, state the exact steps that you followed to recruit people or documents. For example, did you contact people by email, phone calls, or text messages? Did you ask your network or colleagues and friends for suggestions? If you're doing textual analysis, did you do a keyword search for the text? Here's a template. Participants were recruited by, and then outline the specific details of what you did. Here's a sample. Participants were recruited using a LinkedIn advanced search. Profiles aged 27 to 43 were searched. 334 individuals were sent direct messages. Lastly, justify the sample size. This is a significantly larger step than it looks. Often, research students use bad justifications for their sample size. Some bad justifications include lacking the time or resources. This justification is not a reflection of the quality or rigor of your data analysis, but just an admission of a failure on your part. Similarly, often students simply state that it is normal for qualitative studies to have a certain number of research participants, such as 15 for interviews. This is not a good justification for why you stopped at a certain number of participants. Here are some better justifications. The first is saturation points. This is when you reach a point where no new themes emerge from the last few participants that you interviewed or datasets that you looked at. This suggests that including more participants or datasets in the study beyond the ones you've already examined is not likely to generate any new themes. Another good justification is information power, which is to argue that it's better to go into depth with a small group than to look at a larger group in a shallow way. Often, you only need a small group of people to give you a lot of information. To learn more about saturation and information power, including the 4 different types of saturation and best type of saturation you should use for your study, and to find out how to use a saturation journal to defend your claims of the ideal amounts of people for your study, you can find the relevant fast-track cheat sheets and templates through the link in the description. A quick note for people using grounded theory. You will be expected to use a special type of saturation called theoretical saturation as your justification. The fast-track cheat sheets will guide you on how to do this. Here's a template for justifying your sample size. The final sample size of, and then say how many people were included in your sample, was settled on because, and then outline your justification. Here's a sample. At the end of recruitment, 15 participants were included in this study. This number was considered sufficient because of the information power of the participant group. information power refers to, and then you'll outline the concept of information power. That brings us to the end of section 3.7, the sampling methods. In this section, you should explain the participant group, explain the sampling method, justified the sampling method, outlined your inclusion-exclusion criteria, outlined your recruitment procedure, and justified your sample size either by using saturation methods or information power. Section 3.8 outlines the data collection method that you used. 6 common data collection methods are semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews, focus group, participant observation, non-participant observation, and document retrieval. I'll outline each of these briefly and then show you how to write about your data collection methods in your methodology chapter. First is the most common method, semi-structured interviews. These involve collecting interviews that follow an interview guide that you will have created before conducting the interviews. And the interview guide will contain a set of open-ended questions that are asked to every research participant. In semi-structured interviews, the researcher is empowered to ask follow-up questions to probe deeper into participants' responses, with the goal of generating rich data from each individual research participant. The strength of semi-structured interviews is that it allows researchers to get deep insights into people's experiences and beliefs. However, a weakness is that the rapport between the interviewer and the research participant affects the richness of the data collected, which means that the skill of the interviewer significantly affects the data generated. Another approach is unstructured interviews. In unstructured interviews, open-ended conversations take place with no fixed set of questions at the outset, which allows the participants to guide the discussion more fully. A strength of this is that it leads to rich and detailed narratives focused on the participants' interests and focus, and is useful for exploratory and blue sky studies. However, unstructured interviews lack focus, and this often means that the data doesn't closely link to the study's research question, which is why it's usually recommended to use semi-structured interviews instead. Next is focus groups. This is where discussions take place among groups of research participants, often involving between 6 and 8 people. Here, the researcher acts as a facilitator of a discussion, using a question guide but allowing the group to have conversations with one another based upon the questions presented. The strength of focus groups is that it encourages group interaction, which leads to rich data that is often not possible through one-to-one interviews. It's also very effective for collecting multiple perspectives in one session, because you conduct one focus group and get multiple different people providing answers. However, focus groups do have many weaknesses, including that dominant voices within the focus group tend to overshadow quieter people within the group, which marginalizes quieter perspectives. Furthermore, during a focus group session, a lot of people moderate their perspectives and choose not to share them because they're in a group setting. Next is participant observation, which involves the researcher observing the environment in which they are also a participant. Here, the researcher takes field notes, photographs, recordings, or journals, which they will then analyze later on. Strengths of this method include that it leads to deep insights from an insider of a particular setting, which helps to generate rich first-person data. However, over-involvement in the setting can lead to loss of perspective and significant bias. Furthermore, the presence of the researcher may alter the research participant's behavior. Non-participant observation is similar to participant observation, but you do not participate in the activities of the group. Here, the researcher is a fly on the wall, observing what other people are doing. In this approach, the researcher is able to focus on taking notes rather than participating in activities. However, during observations, the researcher often doesn't have access to participants' own thoughts and motivations in the same way as they would during interviews. Lastly, we have document retrieval. This is where the researcher collects sets of documents such as film, books, newspaper articles, internet archives, records, and policy briefs, which they will then analyze through linguistic and semiotic analysis methods. A strength of this approach is that it is an unobtrusive way of gathering data. Practically, it is a relatively easy approach because you can get the data off the internet or similar open source locations without having to get researcher participants together to give you their insights. A weakness of this approach is that it doesn't actually gather real people's insights and interpretations of the texts that are being analyzed. Instead, it usually relies on linguistic analysis.
For each of these data collection methods, I have fast-track cheat sheets with references and practical instructions on how to do each method. As you know by now, you can grab all of the cheat sheets through the link in the description. Here are the steps for conducting data collection. First, name the data collection method used. Second, describe the data collection method. Third, justify your choice. Fourth, describe your tools or protocols. Starting with naming the data collection method that you used, here's a template. Data were collected through, and then name the data collection method. Here's a sample. Data were collected through semi-structured interviews. In the next step, describe the data collection method. Here, provide a clear definition and explanation that demonstrates your depth of knowledge about the data collection method that you selected, and remember to cite a source or several sources. Here's a template. This method involves, and then explain what the method involves. Here's a sample. This method involves conducting detailed, in-depth, one-to-one interviews with each research participant to gather their perceptions, insights, and experiences on the research question. In the third step, justify why you chose this data collection method. Here, explain that this data collection method is the best method for answering your research question. You can find a strength of your chosen data collection method in the explanations I provided earlier in this video, or you can check your data collection method's fast-track cheat sheet. You know where to get that. Here's a template. The benefit of this method for this study was, and then outline the benefit. Here's a sample. The overall benefit of interviews was that they addressed the qualitative and phenomenological focus on participants' experiences. The last set is to describe your tools or protocols. Here, outline exactly what you went about doing. For example, were the interviews in person or online? Did you record the interviews? Did you create an interview guide? And how long were the interviews? If you were doing interviews or focus groups, you can grab an interview protocol matrix along with all the other resources, and this will show you how to construct the interviews and how to test them before using them for your study. Here's a template on what to write. An interview guide was developed based upon, and then state your research topic and aims, and has been included in the appendix of this thesis. Interviews took place between, and then state the dates in which it took place, in, and then state the location in which it took place. And interviews took approximately, and state how long the interviews lasted. Here's an example. An interview guide was developed based on Castillo-Montoya's interview protocol refinement matrix. Interviews with research participants were collected via Zoom and lasted between 12 and 18 minutes. That brings us to the end of section 3.8, the data collection methods. In this section, you should have named your data collection method that you used, described the data collection method, justified your choice, and described the tools or protocols you followed to go about collecting your data. Section 3.9 is where you outline your data analysis methods. After collecting your data, you should have documents that you can analyze, such as interview transcripts, observational field notes, or in the case of documents, the documents themselves. The data analysis process involves reading through those documents, transcripts, and notes to identify themes that would then form the basis of your analysis chapter. 3 common approaches to data analysis are reflexive thematic analysis, interpretative phenomenological analysis, and grounded theory coding. Reflexive thematic analysis, which was founded by Braun and Clark, is a general 6-phase approach to identifying themes from data. This approach has a strength that it has very clear guidelines and can be used for most qualitative study designs. It's often considered to be the default data analysis method because it is used across most designs and is very versatile. Interpretative phenomenological analysis is a data collection method specifically used in phenomenological designs. It has its own core concepts such as the double hermeneutic, ideography, and phenomenology. These core concepts inform the data analysis process, but as with reflexive thematic analysis, IPA also contains a multi-step process that you need to follow and document in order to demonstrate how you went about your data analysis. Our third common approach is grounded theory coding. This is specifically used within grounded theory designs and also has its own set of procedures and concepts, such as constant comparison, theoretical saturation, and theoretical sampling. This is a three-phase approach, but these phases are often cyclical, and in grounded theory, the researcher continues to go back and collect additional data throughout the analysis process. As you should know by now, you'll be able to get cheat sheets on the phases for each of these approaches, templates for data analysis for each of these approaches, and samples that show how your data analysis should look across all of these methods. And you can grab them after you've downloaded the template in the link in the description. To write up your data analysis section, here are 4 steps. First, introduce your data analysis method. Second, state whether it's inductive, deductive, or provisional. Third, justify your choice. And fourth, describe the steps involved. Starting with introducing your data analysis, state the data analysis method you chose and explain the core concepts and benefits of your data analysis method. Here's a template. To analyze the collected data, your data analysis method was employed. Here's a sample. Following transcription, data analysis using Smith's interpretative phenomenological analysis, which is a data analysis method grounded in the hermeneutic phenomenological approach. In step 2, outline whether your data analysis method was inductive, deductive, or provisional. A deductive approach involves having predetermined ideas, such as a hypothesis that you are seeking to find information about. An inductive approach is when you approach the data without predetermined ideas because you want ideas to emerge out of the data. A provisional approach uses a mix of deductive and inductive methods. For example, deductive elements might include having a research question, having a theory, or having ideas based upon your literature review, which will inevitably inform your analysis. However, there might be a strong inductive element of your work as well, such as the fact that you don't know exactly what things will arrive yet because you want them to emerge out of the data. So provisional is a mix of deductive and inductive. Here's a template. The coding approach was, and then state whether it was inductive, deductive, or provisional, which is, and then define your chosen approach. Here's a sample. An interpretative phenomenological approach is considered to be highly inductive, whereby themes and findings are constructed through close reading of the data. However, some deductive elements were evident inasmuch as the study was informed by a clear research question, and then the sample goes on from there. In the third step, justify your choice of data analysis method. Here are 2 justifications. First, you could state that your data analysis method is consistent with your research design. So for example, if you're using a grounded theory design, then it's consistent with that design to do grounded theory coding. A second justification is that your chosen data analysis method will help you to achieve your research question, and therefore it's a valid data analysis method to use. Here's a template. These data analysis decisions were employed because, and then outline your justification. Here's an example. These data analysis decisions were employed because interpretative phenomenological analysis is uniquely suited for exploring how individuals make sense of significant experiences. In the 4th step, describe the steps that were involved in your data analysis. You'll notice that I presented the exact steps for each analysis method when I introduced the methods earlier. You might want to grab the cheat sheets for each of the data analysis methods, which outline all the key phases in full detail. Here's a template. The first step in the data analysis was, and explains step 1. The second step involved, and then explains step 2. Third step involved, and then explains step 3, and so on until you've outlined all of your steps. You'll notice in the sample thesis that a table overview is provided that outlines the steps, and then a paragraph is provided underneath that explains the steps in paragraph form. This is a very common approach that you'll see in methodology chapters of theses to demonstrate what you did. Of course, you will also have to follow that data analysis method to physically analyze your data when you receive your transcripts. I provided analysis templates for you as well, and you'll know where to get them, and that will help you structure your data analysis and walk you through how to physically generate the themes before you move on to the findings chapter. There are templates for all data collection methods. So if you collected field notes, there are templates for analyzing field notes. If you collected interview transcripts, there are templates for analyzing interview transcripts, and so on. That brings us to the end of section 3.9, the data analysis method. In this section, you should have introduced your data analysis method, explained whether it was inductive, deductive, or provisional, justified your choice,
and described the steps involved.
Section 3.10 outlines the ethical considerations for your study. For any study affecting humans or animals, or any study that contains research participants, you would need to receive ethical approval from your university. Hopefully, you will have already received ethics approval and you would want to use that information from your ethics approval process for this section. So if you have an ethics approval form, have it handy right now. If you only conducted data analysis of publicly available texts for a textual or discourse analysis, you may not need to have received ethics approval, but you will still need an ethics section stating why you didn't need ethics approval. This section has 4 steps. First, state the ethics approval that you received. Second, describe the informed consent procedures that were followed. Third, discuss how you ensured confidentiality and anonymity. And fourth, describe how research participants were able to withdraw from the study. Starting with stating your ethics approval, here you will need to name the ethics board that you received your ethics approval from. Here's a template. Prior to data collection, ethical approval was received by, and then name the granting institution. Then finish with, in order to, and then state why you needed ethics approval. Here's an example. Prior to data collection, ethical approval was received by the University Ethics Review Board in order to ensure the interviews were conducted ethically. The next step is to describe your informed consent procedures. This will involve explaining that you provided a participant information sheet to the research participants to inform them of what was in your study, and that you received written consent using a consent form that the research participants signed. I have a participant information sheet and consent form templates in with the additional resources if you need them. Here's a template. One element of ensuring ethical compliance was ensuring informed consent, which involved, and then you would explain the procedure you used. Here's an example. Informed consent was obtained through the use of a participant information sheet, which was provided to participants prior to data collection, see Appendix E, and use of a consent form that all research participants voluntarily signed, see Appendix F. The third step is to discuss confidentiality and anonymity. In this section, make sure you write 3 points. First, that pseudonyms were used to protect the anonymity of research participants. Second, that the data was stored securely. If the data was stored on the internet or on a computer, make sure password-protected files were used. If there was physical data, it should have been kept in a locked drawer. Third, state that the data will be destroyed or has been destroyed upon conclusion of the research program. Here's a template. 3 approaches were employed for protecting the identity of participants. First, and then state the anonymity procedure. Second, state the data protection procedure. Third, state the data deletion procedure. Here's an example. Confidentiality and anonymity procedures for the study included using pseudonyms for research participants' names and storing electronic data on password-protected cloud files on university servers. Physical documents were stored in the research supervisor's locked office. All data will be destroyed upon completion of the program. The fourth step is to describe how participants could withdraw from the study. State that you informed participants that they could withdraw from the research without having to give reason, and that you gave them a fair date by which they could withdraw from the study. Oftentimes, after a certain date, withdrawal is not practically possible, either because you have already submitted your thesis or because data analysis has already been completed. And lastly, state that you provided participants with a withdrawal form and told them that they could fill out that form and send it to you in order to state that they will be withdrawing from the study. Here's an example of a participant withdrawal form. You can grab that with all of the additional resources. Here's a template for writing this step. Participants were informed of their right to withdraw by, and then explain the procedure. Here's a sample. Furthermore, research participants were provided with a voluntary withdrawal form that reaffirmed their right to withdraw without reason, see Appendix G. That brings us to the end of section 3.10, the ethical considerations. In this section, you should have stated your ethics approval, described informed consent procedures, discussed confidentiality and anonymity,
and described how participants could withdraw from your study.
Section 3.11 is where you outline how you ensured your study was trustworthy. In quantitative research, reliability and validity are used to demonstrate a study's rigor. However, in qualitative research, these concepts are not useful. Instead, the most common framework is Guber's trustworthiness framework. Trustworthiness contains four key concepts.
These are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Credibility refers to the degree to which the phenomenon has been observed holistically. In other words, did you explore the whole situation and consider all of its factors, or did you just look at something very specific without considering all the other possible variables? I've included a picture of an elephant here because a good metaphor for this is if you were to look at an elephant just from behind, you wouldn't know that it has a trunk or any of its facial features. So you need to look at the elephant from a bunch of different angles in order to fully be able to describe an elephant. The same goes for an academic study. You need to look at your phenomenon holistically in order to fully describe it. Second is transferability, which refers to how well the researcher explained the setting and people in the study so that others can decide if the study applies to their own situation. Dependability refers to how consistently you applied your methods for data analysis and collection. It includes ensuring that those methods were appropriately selected and applied for your study. Confirmability refers to whether the findings are clearly linked to the data and not cherry-picked or tied to the researcher's own agendas or biases. There are many different ways that you can demonstrate all four of these factors, but you only need to choose one way to demonstrate each factor. For your honors thesis, I'll walk you through the most straightforward way to cover each element that would apply to the maximum number of people. These are, for credibility, peer debriefing; for transferability, thick description; for dependability, a dependability audit; and for confirmability, a confirmability audit. To do this, you will need an audit trail. I've included an audit trail template in the link in the description. When you download the thesis template, you'll find the instructions for how to grab the audit trail template. I'd recommend filling out that audit trail and putting it in your appendix to help you to demonstrate that you've completed all four of these elements. Starting with credibility. Credibility refers to the degree to which the phenomenon has been observed holistically. And what you need to ask yourself here is, did you explore the whole situation and consider all factors related to the situation in order to accurately and thoroughly describe it? A good method for honors students is the peer debriefing method. This involves consulting with your supervisor or a trusted peer, where you present your work to them on a regular basis and have them challenge you on whether you have had blind spots or missed ways to more deeply or holistically analyze and interpret the topic. Going back to the audit trail template, the first part of the audit trail involves taking notes on your meeting minutes with your supervisor, with a specific focus on how your supervisor has helped you to understand your topic more deeply. Next is transferability. The main recognized way of achieving transferability is thick description. Transferability is how well the researcher explains the setting and people in the study so others can decide if the findings apply to their own situation. The question you need to ask yourself here is, did I explain my settings and research participants in detail within the thesis? To achieve this, thick description is required. This refers to writing about the settings, participants, and findings in a detailed way. This is achieved in your settings section, which was section 3.6 of the methodology, as well as in your description of your research participants, which was section 3.7 of the methodology. Furthermore, it involves making sure that you have thorough explanations of the context of your findings throughout your data analysis chapters. For dependability, a very accessible way to demonstrate dependability is through a dependability audit. So dependability is about how consistently you apply your methods for data collection and analysis. The question you need to ask yourself here is, are the methods you used appropriate for generating rich and quality data that will help you to answer the research question? To demonstrate dependability in an honors thesis, I recommend using a dependability audit, which involves regularly meeting with your research supervisor or a trusted peer. But this time it is about checking your data collection work, both prior to data collection, which usually involves bringing an interview protocol to your research supervisor to have them check over it, and also after your work of data collection has been completed, which involves bringing your raw transcripts to your research supervisor to check whether you generated rich data sufficient to answer the research question. Last is confirmability. An accessible way to achieve confirmability is through a confirmability audit. Confirmability is about whether the findings are clearly linked to the data and not cherry-picked. The question you need to ask yourself is, are the themes generated through my data analysis process accurately reflected within the raw transcripts? To demonstrate confirmability in the trustworthiness section of your methodology, explain your confirmability audit process. This audit reflects that you have regularly met with your research supervisor or a trusted peer, and this time it is to check your data analysis work. This will involve bringing your coded transcripts with highlighted key themes and key quotes to seek feedback from your supervisor on your coding and theme generation. You should also provide a sample coded transcript in your thesis appendix, which can help with demonstrating confirmability. All four of those steps can be demonstrated using the audit trail that I provided in the additional resources. All you need to do is fill out that audit trail and then write up section 3.11 of your thesis. I'm going to show you how to do that now. Section 3.11 has 5 steps. These are defining and explaining trustworthiness, describing how you achieved credibility, describing how you achieved transferability, describing how you achieved dependability, and describing how you achieved confirmability. Starting with defining and explaining trustworthiness, state that trustworthiness is the recognized way of achieving rigor in qualitative studies. Explain the origins of the concept by referring to Guber's work and signpost the 4 concepts of trustworthiness, which are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Here's a template. Qualitative research uses the concept of trustworthiness too, and explain why people use the concept of trustworthiness. The seminal work of Guber explains and then give an overview of Guber's framework, and then finish up with key components of this framework are, and list those 4 key components. Here's an example. One of the most widely used and recognized frameworks is Guber's trustworthiness framework, which continues to be extensively used in qualitative research today. Guber's framework contains 4 criteria that should be met by qualitative studies: credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Each of these criteria have been addressed in the study as outlined below. Next, describe how you achieved credibility. First, explain that credibility is the degree to which the variables have been observed holistically and context has not been stripped from the study. Remember the metaphor of the elephant here, where we want to make sure that we describe the elephant from all angles. After explaining what credibility is, say that you addressed this through peer debriefing and explain in detail that you met with your supervisor regularly to have them challenge you on how holistically you approached the study. Here's a template. First, credibility refers to, and then define credibility in qualitative research. One way to achieve credibility is peer debriefing. Peer debriefing refers to, and then define peer debriefing. Peer debriefing was achieved in this study through, and then explain how you sought and received peer debriefing. Here's an example. It's quite long, so you can pause the screen if you want to read it, and I'll move on to the next section, which is describing how you achieved transferability. Here, explain that transferability refers to providing enough detail about the setting, research participants, and findings to help readers determine if the study is relevant to their own situation. Then outline that you address this through thick description and explain where you provided thick description in your thesis. Here's a template. Second, transferability refers to, and then define transferability in qualitative research. One way to achieve transferability is thick description. Thick description refers to, and then define thick description. This was achieved in your study through, and explain how you achieved thick description. Here's an example. Again, it's quite long, so you can pause the screen if you want to read the full example. The next step is describing how you achieved dependability. Here, explain that dependability refers to demonstrating that you consistently applied methods for data collection, and state that you addressed this through a dependability audit and explain how the audit was conducted. Here's a template. Third, dependability refers to, and then define dependability in qualitative research. One way to achieve dependability is through a dependability audit. A dependability audit is, and define dependability audits. Conclude with, a dependability audit was completed in this study through, and explain your dependability audit process. Here's an example. Again, it's quite long, so you can pause the screen to look at the example. Next is describing how the study achieved confirmability. Here, explain that confirmability refers to demonstrating that your findings are closely linked to the data rather than being cherry-picked by the author to confirm their own biases. Here, say that you address this through a confirmability audit and explain how a confirmability audit was conducted. Here's a template. Fourth, confirmability refers to and define confirmability in qualitative research. One way to achieve confirmability is through a confirmability audit. The confirmability audit is, and then define what a confirmability audit is. Conclude with, and this was completed in the study through, and explain your confirmability audit process. Here's an example. It's quite long, so you can pause the screen and read it if you would like. It outlines how you approached your research advisor to get them to check over your data coding and included a coded transcript in the appendix, as well as your confirmability audit trail that provides meeting minutes from your supervisor meetings. That's the end of section 3.11, the trustworthiness section. By the end of this section, you should have defined and explained trustworthiness, described how you achieved credibility, described how you achieved transferability, described how you achieved dependability, and described how you achieved confirmability. Don't forget to grab the audit trail for trustworthiness that you would need to include in your appendix to show how you achieved trustworthiness, which was mostly through meeting minutes with your supervisor. You can get that audit trail when you download the Thesis template. There will be instructions on how to get it. Now we'll move on to section 3.12, which covers researcher reflexivity. Researcher reflexivity refers to the awareness of your own views, interpretations, and biases. In qualitative research, it is acknowledged that bias is an inevitable part of the research process. However, it is important that qualitative researchers identify their own biases, identities, and perspectives, which is often called positionality, in order to acknowledge how it affects our work. This entire process is called researcher reflexivity. Aspects of researcher reflexivity that you can discuss in this section include how your own personal background and experiences shape your opinions on a topic, how your identity, such as your race, gender, and social class, will shape how you experience the topic, and how your own personal values, such as your moral, political, or religious values, might affect how your approach to the topic is structured. Researcher reflexivity is a very difficult section to write, but I do have a really good AI prompt that I find very useful for coming up with strong researcher reflexivity points. And as you know, you can get the prompts when you access the additional resources in the link in the description. So here's how to write this section. First, explain researcher reflexivity. Second, identify your positionality. Third, reflect on your position's influence on the study. Fourth, describe how you manage these biases. Starting with explaining researcher reflexivity, the first step is to simply define reflexivity and explain why it is necessary in qualitative research. Here's a template. Researcher reflexivity is defined as, and then insert your definition. It is necessary because, and then insert your reason. Here's an example. Reflexivity in qualitative research refers to the researcher's ongoing consciousness that their worldview, assumptions, and personal history can and do influence a study at all levels. The next step is to identify your positionality. To do this, consider writing about one or more of the following elements. First, you may outline that your previous experiences and perspectives on the topic, such as whether it's related to your profession or your past history engaging with the topic, affects your own views on the topic. Second, you may also write about how your social identity is related to the topic, such as whether your race, gender, or social class is privileged or underprivileged in relation to the topic. Third, you could discuss your values, such as your morals, religious, or political values, and how they shape your views on the topic. Here's a template. My positionality as a researcher is, and then identify your positionality. Here's a sample. The researcher's position as a millennial means they have a stake in any potential social and economic pressures that generative AI may place on millennials. It also goes on to explain how the researcher is an AI-curious technology user, and that has shaped their perspective of the topic. The third step is to reflect on your position's influence on the study. In other words, how might your positionality or assumptions affect how you approach the study? You can use the prompt provided to help brainstorm how your position, such as your gender, race, or past history of the topic, may be subtly and even subconsciously influencing your approach to the topic. Here's a template. My positionality affects the research by, and explain how your positionality could influence the study. Here's an example. As a millennial interviewing millennials, the researcher was aware of a horizontal power balance between researcher and research participants. This was considered a positive element of the study. However, it is also a case that an outsider may have pursued the follow-up questions or prompts in a way that may have opened up different lines of inquiry. The next step is to describe how you managed biases or the influence of your positionality on the study. Many students make the mistake here to claim that they try to be objective and unbiased. However, in a qualitative study that uses interpretivism, constructivism, or critical theory as its research paradigm, the belief is that you can never achieve objectivity or be unbiased. Everyone has their own history that they bring to a topic, and therefore they will always subjectively interpret the topic. However, you can manage your bias without having to try to appear objective. In other words, the intention here is to demonstrate that you have been professional, data-oriented, and rigorous rather than objective. So here, focus on how you demonstrated your ethics and trustworthiness in order to make sure that your study is of high academic standards, rather than trying to claim that you approached the research objectively. Here's a template. Because my positionality has effects, I have made efforts to and explain how you have been ethical and trustworthy with reference to previous sections in the methodology chapter. Here's an example. Overall, the researcher's positionality necessarily opened up some lines of inquiry while closing up others. It is important that quality benchmarks for trustworthiness continue to be maintained. Key to this was establishing transparent audit trails, interview protocols, and transcript analyses to show the work. That brings us to the end of section 3.12 on researcher reflexivity. In this section, you should have explained the concept of researcher reflexivity, identified your own positionality, reflected on your position's influence on the study, and described how you managed bias in the study. The next section is section 3.13, which outlines the methodological limitations. A quick note that you will notice that there is also a limitations section in the conclusion chapter of the thesis. The limitations discussion in the methodology chapter is focused on the limitations of your methodology specifically. The limitations discussed in the conclusion chapter will be about a practical and reflective discussion of limitations more broadly, which takes place after the study has been completed. We will discuss your reflection on practical limitations when we get to that conclusion chapter. So in section 3.13, you will need to state that all studies do have methodological limitations, and by identifying yours and highlighting why they exist, you are demonstrating intellectual honesty. Here are 3 typical limitations of qualitative research. These are not the only potential limitations you could discuss, but they are some of the most common. The first is lack of generalizability, which refers to the fact that a qualitative study that focuses on one specific context may not reflect the reality in all other contexts. So, for example, you cannot say all millennials believe a certain thing about AI just because the 15 millennials in this specific study did. This is one of the weaknesses of qualitative research in general, but there is a trade-off because the strength of a focused qualitative study is that there is more depth and context than could be achieved in a broad quantitative study. So you're sacrificing generalizability in order to achieve depth. Another limitation of qualitative research is that it can be accused of subjectivity and bias because the researcher is seen as an active interpreter and participant in the research process. To mitigate this, you can say that you employed trustworthiness strategies as discussed earlier in this chapter. A third typical limitation of qualitative research is the fact that qualitative studies tend to have small sample sizes because you cannot have one-to-one interviews with hundreds or thousands of people. They're just too detailed and in-depth. A way to show that you mitigated this limitation is to say that you achieved saturation points or information power as discussed in the data sampling section of this chapter. So here's what to write. First, provide an orientation. Then outline the methodological limitations that you faced. Then outline the consequences of those methodological limitations, and finally, reconcile your choice by highlighting how you managed or are able to justify those limitations. Starting with the orientation, simply state that this section will explore the limitations of the study's methodology. You may also choose to signpost the limitations you're about to discuss. Here's a template. The methodology for this study has some limitations, including limitation 1, limitation 2, and limitation 3. The sample says, limitations of the selected methodology include lack of generalizability, exclusion of several social groups worthy of analysis, and reliance on self-reported data. Next, name your first methodological limitation. You could choose to write about lack of generalizability, subjectivity and bias, small sample size, or any other methodological limitation you can identify. Here's a template. One limitation of this study is, and then name your limitation. Here's an example. Firstly, the decision to conduct a qualitative study meant that the findings from the study are not considered to be generalizable to a broader population. Next, name the consequence of this limitation. For example, explain that the consequence of this limitation is that your findings cannot be applied in all contexts and that your study may not be replicable by future researchers. Here's a template. This limitation means that, and then state the consequence. Here's an example. Were a quantitative study conducted, broad and generalizable insights about millennials' attitudes and technological acceptance may have been generated. In the next step, reconcile your choice. This means highlighting how you minimized any negative consequences. For example, you could highlight why your study is a valuable and worthwhile study regardless of that limitation. It could also involve stating how you accepted this limitation in order to gain other strengths. For example, you could highlight how you sacrificed generalizability for depth. Here's a template. However, this study continues to be of value because, and then outline the benefit of your choice. Here's an example. However, it was determined that an in-depth and nuanced study of perceptions was more appropriate this time, as the findings may help to more thoroughly inform policy and practice. The depth that this study was able to achieve was on balance considered to be optimal over shallow general findings. Finally, repeat steps 2, 3, and 4 in this section to outline multiple limitations of your methodology in order to show depth and thoroughness in your understandings of the limitations of your study and why those limitations are acceptable. That brings us to the end of section 3.13 about methodological limitations. In this section, you should have provided an orientation to the section, named your methodological limitations, named the consequences of those limitations, and reconciled your choices. Section 3.14 is the final section of the methodology and is your chapter's conclusion. The conclusion has 3 steps. First, provide an orientation topic sentence. Second, provide a chapter summary. Third, transition to the next chapter. In the orientation, clearly and succinctly state what the chapter was about. Here, reiterate the purpose of the chapter, which was also mentioned in the introduction. You may choose to go back and look at the introduction to see what you wrote there about the purpose of the chapter. Here's a template. The purpose of this chapter was to, and explain what the chapter was about. Here's an example. The purpose of this chapter was to outline the methodological decisions of the study in order to transparently demonstrate the study's quality and rigor. Next, summarize the chapter. Go step by step through each section of the chapter, briefly summarizing the methodological decisions you made. Ideally, you'd also want to show how all of these decisions are interconnected. For example, that your paradigm informed your approach informed your design informed your sampling collection and analysis methods, and so on. Here's a template. First, the chapter explained first section, then it explored second section, next it looked at decisions surrounding third section, etc. Here's an example. The chapter explained how the use of an interpretivist paradigm informed the choice of a qualitative approach and phenomenological design. It then demonstrated how the use of purposive criterion sampling, semi-structured interviews, and interpretative phenomenological analysis were all selected to be consistent with the choice of a phenomenological design. And then it goes on from there, explaining the sections that followed. Finally, look forward to the next chapter, which is the findings and analysis discussion. Logically bridge the methodology to the findings by stating that the findings were arrived at by following the methodological procedure outlined in this chapter. Here's a template. The next chapter explores the themes of, and lists your themes,
that emerged from, and then name your data collection and data analysis methods that were outlined in this chapter. Here's an example. Based upon the above listed methodological decisions, the data analysis led to the following themes, and then it lists the themes, and then it closes with, these themes will be discussed and analyzed in the next chapter. That brings us to the end of section 3.14, the conclusion to the methodology. In this section, you should have provided a topic sentence outlining the purpose of the chapter, provided a chapter summary, and looked forward to create a bridge to the next chapter. Chapter 4 is the findings and analysis chapter. There are 3 common ways to construct a findings and analysis discussion in a thesis. The first, most common in quantitative theses, is to separate findings and analysis. Here, the researcher presents a findings chapter where the researcher does not compare their findings to existing literature or analyze it, followed by an analysis and discussion chapter where the researcher does compare their findings to existing literature and presents an analysis. It is more common in qualitative research to present findings and analysis at the same time, as shown in designs 2 and 3, because for qualitative researchers, data analysis is inherently interpretative, and therefore it is difficult to separate findings from analysis. The second design here is to present all of the findings and analysis in one chapter, and the third design is to present findings and analysis of each theme in separate chapters. For this video, I'll present design 2, where we present our findings and analysis in one cohesive chapter. If you find that the chapter gets too long, you may choose design 3, where you can separate each theme into a separate findings and analysis chapter. Okay, let's begin. The chapter has 3 sections: an introduction, a discussion of the findings and analysis of themes, and a summary of key findings and conclusion. Starting with the introduction, state the purpose of the chapter, then signpost the themes that you will discuss through the chapter. To start the chapter, highlight its purpose, which is to present and analyze the findings of your study. Here's a template. This chapter presents the findings generated during, and then state your data analysis procedure. Here's an example. The chapter presents the findings obtained from the 15 semi-structured interviews and 6-step interpretative phenomenological analysis procedure. In step 2, signpost your themes. List all the key themes that will be discussed in the chapter in the order in which they will be presented. Remember, in an academic thesis, it is expected that writers signpost all the sections at the beginning of the chapter so the reader is not surprised about anything that is coming up. Here's a template. During data analysis, the following themes were constructed: Theme 1, Theme 2, Theme 3, and Theme 4. Here's an example. During data analysis, the following themes were constructed: disempowerment and resignation, changing roles in the workplace, generative AI as a beast to be tamed, and despair for the future. That brings us to the end of section 4.1, the introduction to the findings and analysis. In this section, you should have stated the purpose of the chapter and signposted the themes that you will discuss throughout the chapter. Section 4.2 outlines the findings and analysis of themes. This will be a long section that outlines all of the key themes and analyzes them. It will present the data from the data analysis in a thematic format, analyze the findings in relation to the existing literature, and link the findings back to the research questions. For this section, there are 6 steps. First, introduce your theme. Second, describe your theme. Third, present and explain illustrative examples. Fourth, explain the examples. Fifth, analyze the theme in relation to existing literature. And sixth, link the theme to the study's research questions. Starting with introducing the theme, simply name the first theme in a topic sentence. Here, refer to the theme broadly rather than referring to any specific studies yet. Here's a template. The first theme that was constructed from the data was, and then name the theme. Here's an example. The first theme constructed from the data was the theme of disempowerment and resignation. Step 2 is to describe the theme. Here, present all your relevant insights that describe the overall theme with the goal of helping the reader to understand the theme in rich detail, remembering that thick description is an expectation in qualitative research. At this stage, you will be describing your theme at a high level and not referring to any specific studies just yet. Continue to focus on the theme as a whole. Here's a template. This theme explores the insights from multiple research participants' thoughts and then describe the overall theme in detail. Here's an example.
This theme explores the overwhelming sense from research participants that generative AI in the workplace has potential to shift power from the worker to either the tool itself or leadership. And then it goes on from there to explain the theme in detail. Step 3 is to present and explain illustrative examples. Here, you can begin to introduce specific examples such as quotes from your transcript, written field notes from data observation, quotes from a policy document you analyzed, or even screenshots from a film analysis. To do this, give context or an introduction to the quote and then insert the quote or image or whatever your data is. Here's a template. One example was from pseudonym, who was discussing topic when he said, quote. Here's an example. One example was Gregory, who was discussing how his use of an AI brainstorming and organizational tool called Miro AI changed his sense of professional self, and then the quote is inserted. Step 4 is to explain the example. You should always follow up your quote with an explanation of why you consider the quote to reveal something important. Many students often forget to explain and discuss the quote and just insert quotes without context. In a qualitative thesis in particular, it is very important that you explain the quotes that you insert in order to contextualize them. Here's a template. Here, pseudonym is demonstrating an interesting point about, and then break down the quote and analyze it. Here's an example. Here, Gregory is touching on a common concern among the research participants that they are no longer creators, instead they are curators of information and knowledge. One aspect of Gregory's reply that is of particular interest is, and it goes on to continue to discuss Gregory's quotes. Next, repeat these steps so you can introduce multiple quotes or other illustrative examples from within your dataset and explain each one in order to demonstrate that there are multiple research participants or texts who all discussed or touched on the theme that you have identified. This helps to show that your theme isn't just a one-off, but it spans across the dataset. The 5th step is to analyze the theme in relation to existing literature. This is the most important step where, now that you have presented the theme, you need to explore how your theme fits into the body of discussion about the topic. There are 3 ways to do this, and you should integrate all 3 of these approaches at different points throughout your analysis. Firstly, you can show how your findings support the existing literature on the topic, which would be a situation where you found the same things as previous studies. The next is to extend upon previous studies, highlighting how your findings both support the existing literature and go further by adding new information. And the third method is to contrast against the existing literature by highlighting how your findings challenge or are different to the findings of past studies. Here's an example for support. The findings complement existing studies which also find that and then outline the key insight. Here's an example. The findings complement existing studies, and then it lists the existing studies in citations, which demonstrate that, and then it quotes from the existing studies. Here's a template for extending the past literature. The findings support existing study, but add to it by showing not only existing knowledge, but also new knowledge. Here's an example where the sample thesis is showing that it is not only supporting existing literature, but it is adding to it. You can pause the screen if you want to read that example. Lastly, here's a template for contrasting your findings against previous studies. This finding conflicts with previous study, which finds previous finding because why and how your finding is different. Here's an example where the sample thesis is showing that it is contradicting existing literature. You can pause the screen if you want to read that example. It's important that across your findings chapter, you provide examples of support, extend, and contrast at various points. A mistake many students make is they only support existing literature without showing how their study adds to the existing literature or contradicts it. The last step is to link the research questions. At the end of the discussion of your theme, make sure you have shown that the theme is helping to answer your research questions. You could use the exact wording from your research questions and/or regularly closely paraphrase them throughout your findings and analysis chapter to show that your findings and analysis are closely linked to and answering the research questions that you presented at the beginning of the study. Here's a template. This theme demonstrates how, and then insert a paraphrased research question, is answered by, and then insert your answer to the research question. In the example, the research question is, how do millennials experience generative AI at work? The conclusion to the theme reads, overall, the first theme demonstrates how millennials' experiences of generative AI in the workplace have often been disempowering. Here, it is showing that you are answering the question titled, how do millennials experience generative AI at work, by stating that generative AI is a disempowering experience for millennials. Next, make sure you repeat these steps for each theme. Remember, if your theme discussion goes over several thousand words, you may choose to separate each theme's findings and analysis discussion into separate chapters. That brings us to the end of section 4.2 on findings and analysis of themes. In this section, you should have introduced your themes, described your themes, presented and explained illustrative examples of each theme, discussed the examples of each theme, analyzed the themes in relation to existing literature to support, extend, or contradict past studies, and linked the themes to your research questions. After presenting and analyzing each theme, the chapter should conclude with a summary of key findings and conclusion. First, summarize the themes from the study and then feed forward to the next chapter. To summarize the themes from the study, briefly recap your themes in 1 or 2 paragraphs and how they supported or extended or contradicted past studies. Here's a template. This chapter presented and analyzed the themes identified in the study, theme 1, theme 2, theme 3, and theme 4. The first theme explored and then briefly summarized theme 1, which supported, extended, or contradicting the existing literature. The second theme explored and briefly summarized theme 2, which supported, extended, or contradicted the existing literature, and then continued that for all of your key themes. Here's an example. This chapter analyzed the themes identified in the study, and then it lists the themes. It highlighted how the themes from theme 1, disempowerment, supported existing literature, and then it summarizes the theme. It continues with the findings from theme 2, and then goes on to discuss how the findings from theme 2 either supported, extended, or contradicted the literature. Finally, at the end of the conclusion chapter, feed forward to the next chapter by signposting to the reader what to expect from the conclusion chapter. Here's a template. The next chapter will, and then note the key purpose in the subsections of the conclusion chapter, which we will look at in just a moment. You can pause the screen now if you want to read the conclusion from the example piece. That brings us to the end of section 4.3, the summary of key findings and conclusion. In this section, you should have summarized all of your key themes and fed forward to the next chapter to create a bridge to the overall conclusion and discussion of your thesis. Chapter 5 is the conclusion and discussion chapter. In this chapter, you will provide a final summary of the key findings of your study, explain how it made contributions to academic knowledge, suggest implications or recommendations for policy and practice, reflect on the limitations and challenges of the study, make suggestions for future research, including pointing out continuing research gaps in your topic, and leave a strong final concluding comment. The chapter starts with an introduction that states the purpose of the chapter and signposts the chapter sections. To state the purpose of the chapter, highlight that the purpose of the chapter is to provide a final reflective statement on the overall significance of the research for readers, practitioners, and future researchers. Here's a template. This final chapter will, and then explain its purpose. Here's an example. This final chapter will demonstrate how the research project addressed the research questions and explore how its findings may have real impacts on policy, practice, and research. Next, signpost the subsections. Briefly note all the key elements that the chapter will cover by noting the subsections one by one. Here's a template. This chapter will first, and then the first thing it will discuss, then the second thing it will discuss, then the third thing it will discuss, and so on. Here's an example. This chapter will first summarize the key themes and demonstrate how they addressed the 3 research questions. Next, the chapter will explore the study's contributions to knowledge, including how it had progressed current knowledge of generative AI in the workforce. Then the chapter will, and it continues from there. That brings us to an end to section 5.1, the introduction of the conclusion chapter. In this section, you should have stated the purpose of the chapter and signposted the subsections of the chapter. Section 5.2 outlines the key findings. Here, the goal is to explain how the key findings directly answered the research questions. This may seem a little repetitive because you would have just covered this in the previous chapter, but remember, this conclusion chapter is just that, a conclusion. It should summarize and reinforce your key points. Here are the steps. First, restate the research questions. Second, summarize the findings of the first theme. Third, relate the theme back to the research questions, and then repeat for each theme. Starting with restating the research questions, remind the reader of the research questions that you presented at the very beginning of the thesis before you go on to assess whether you answered these questions sufficiently. Here's a template. This study aimed to address the following research questions, and then list your research questions. Here's an example. You can pause the screen and look at this example if you want. It is an exact copy of where you've inserted your research questions earlier in the thesis. Step 2 is to summarize the findings of the first theme. Present your first theme so that you can then show how it answers the research question that you'll cover in the next step. Here's a template. The first theme identified in the data analysis was, and then summarize the first key finding. Here's an example. The first theme identified by the data analysis was disempowerment, which highlighted how research participants saw generative AI as a double-edged sword, which was a useful tool, and then it goes on to explain the theme further. Third, relate the theme back to the research question. Clearly explain how your findings in this theme answer one of the research questions or more. So here, make sure that you explicitly name the research question when tying it into the theme. Here's a template. This theme helps to answer the first research question, which is, and then name the research question, and then state by, and explain how. Here's an example. This theme helps to answer the first research question, how do millennials experience generative AI at work, by demonstrating that millennials experience generative AI in a variety of ways. And then it goes on and explains the ways. Finally, repeat for each theme, so you have shown how each theme answers the key research questions. As you can see in the screenshot, it is common for each theme summary to cover about one paragraph each, and make sure in each paragraph you tie the theme back to the research questions. That brings us to an end of section 5.2 on the key findings. In this section, you should have restated the research questions, summarized the findings of each theme, and related each theme back to the research questions that the theme answered. Section 5.3 outlines how your study made contributions to academic knowledge. For this section, you will need to explain how your study generated new information that people didn't know before. In other words, what was the research gap that you aimed to fill, and did you fill it in order to add to the existing body of literature? For section 5.3, there are 4 steps. First, state the existing knowledge. Second, state the research gap that you aim to fill. Third, state how you did fill the research gap. And fourth, repeat for any additional contributions if you filled multiple research gaps. Starting with stating the existing knowledge, briefly outline what was already known about the topic. This should be second nature to you at this point because you did write an entire literature review on it. Here's a template. Previous studies have found that, and then summarize what was already known. Here's an example. Previous studies have found that generative AI is both an opportunity and threat to employees at work. Next, state the research gap that you aimed to fill. Here, you will need to state what wasn't previously known, or in other words, restate the research gap that you identified in the literature review. Here's a template. However, previous literature was yet to explore, and then insert your research gap. Here's an example. However, the previous literature was yet to explore millennials' unique experiences specifically. Furthermore, while some past studies explored, and then the sample goes on to name additional research gaps that were identified within the study. Third, state how you filled the research gap. Explain exactly what you found out that added knowledge and successfully filled that gap. Here's a template. To address the research gap, the study explored, and then explain your study's focus or procedure. Through this exploration, the study contributed to existing knowledge by,
and then explain exactly what you found out, which added knowledge and filled the research gap. Here's an example. To address the research gap and explore this unique group, this study explored 15 millennials' experiences of AI in the workplace. The study contributed to existing knowledge by demonstrating that millennials tend to experience generative AI as a force that takes away autonomy and creative freedom in the workplace. If you have multiple research gaps or multiple ways in which you added new knowledge to the literature, you would want to repeat for all contributions. That brings us to an end of section 5.3, the contributions to knowledge. In this section, you should have stated the existing knowledge that was known before your study was conducted, stated the research gap that you aim to fill, and stated how you filled the research gap. Section 5.4 outlines the implications and recommendations for policy and practice. This is not about recommendations for future research, but specifically recommendations for the real world outside of academia. In this section, consider how, based on your new knowledge, insights, and findings, how you might recommend there be changes or improvements in relation to your topic. Often this is broken down to practice recommendations and policy recommendations. Practice recommendations can include recommendations for practitioners. For example, if you have a study about education, you may have recommendations for teachers. Recommendations for supervisors, for example, you may recommend that supervisors in workplaces change their behaviors or leadership models in order to improve the workplace. And you may also have recommendations for activists. For example, by recommending that activists focus on certain aspects of the topic in order to drive change. In terms of policy recommendations, you may make recommendations to leadership about how to make changes to policy within a particular setting. Or you could zoom out and make recommendations to broader professional bodies. In a lot of research areas, there will be a professional body overseeing the licensing of professionals, and you could make recommendations to those bodies about how they should change their policies. Zooming out even further, you could make recommendations to governments to make changes to laws around the topic. I've got a good prompt on how to identify policy and practice recommendations that you can grab through the additional resources linked in the description. Download the thesis template, and the instructions on how to get the additional resources will be listed there. When it comes to writing up the implications and recommendation sections, there are 4 steps. First, present an orientation. Second, name a key recommendation. Third, explain your recommendation by linking it to your findings. And fourth, repeat for all your recommendations and implications. Starting with the orientation, orient the reader to the section by letting them know that you're about to discuss recommendations for policy and practice. Here's a template. Recommendations for this study include Recommendation 1, Recommendation 2, and Recommendation 3. Here's an example. Recommendations from this study include policy recommendations for workplace leadership, as well as specific recommendations for millennials using generative AI at work. Next, name a key recommendation that you're about to zoom in on. Here's a template. The first key recommendation is, and name the recommendation. Here's an example. The first key recommendation is that policymakers and leaders within organizations protect employee autonomy, which could be achieved by, and then it explains how they could implement that recommendation. Next, explain where that recommendation comes from. You should have arrived at this recommendation based upon the findings within your study. Here's a template. The key finding that leads to this recommendation is, and name the key finding. Here's an example. The key finding that leads to this recommendation is that millennials felt as if they lost autonomy when using generative AI tools, and then it goes on to explain how the millennials experienced this loss of autonomy. Then, repeat for all of your recommendations. Do not leave it at just one recommendation. Present several recommendations to demonstrate depth of knowledge and understanding of your topic. That brings us to an end to Section 5.4, the implications and recommendations for policy and practice. In this section, you should have provided an orientation that outlined all of your recommendations, named all of your recommendations, and explained each recommendation by linking it to the findings. Section 5.5 outlines the limitations of your study. This includes both methodological limitations and practical limitations. We did mention methodological limitations in your methodology section. This limitation section in the conclusion should be framed as a reflection at the end of the study. You will have acquired new experiences through conducting the study that will give you greater insights into how the study could have been improved or was otherwise hampered by external challenges. Methodological limitations that you might want to present include the fact that you may have found that your data collection methods, such as semi-structured interviews, was limited after having completed it, and other data collection methods may have been better or may have been helpful in supporting the data collection method you used. That after having recruited the research participants, you found that you were missing key insights from certain populations that were not approached, meaning that your inclusion-exclusion criteria could have been tweaked a little to improve the sorts of people you included in your interviews, focus groups, etc. Or more generally, you could simply state one methodological limitation, that is generalizability of your study and the fact that your qualitative study is not generalizable. Practical limitations that you could reflect on include access issues. So you may have had trouble finding research participants, and this is a very common practical limitation that researchers discuss. Another is external disruptions, such as, for example, you may have lost access to a workplace that you had originally had access to, or in an observational study, you may not have been able to conduct the observations on some days due to rainy weather or other distractions that were out of your hands. And participant attrition, which refers to the fact that some research participants withdraw from the study without giving you any reasons, which is their right, but it also interrupts the study and may have caused challenges in this particular study. Writing up this section has 5 steps. First, orient the readers to the section. Second, name the limitation. Third, explain the limitation. Fourth, show the consequences of the limitation. And then fifth, repeat these steps for all the limitations that you have identified. Starting with the orientation, signpost all of the limitations that you plan on discussing to orient the reader to the section, remembering that signposting is a very important step in academic writing whenever you lead into a new section of your thesis. So here's a template. Although this study has strengths such as, and name a strength of your study, it also had some limitations. Limitations included first limitation, second limitation, third limitation, and so on. Here's an example. Although this study has strengths such as its depth of insights and information power generated from 15 semi-structured interviews, it also has some limitations. Limitations include that the cohort for the study were predominantly white collar, there was only one data collection method used, and the findings did not discriminate by gender, nationality, or profession. Next, zoom in on one specific limitation that you are able to go deeper into. Here's a template. The first key limitation of this study was, and then name and explain the first of your limitations. Here's an example. The first key limitation of this study was that the cohort was predominantly white collar. Next, explain your limitations, state why the limitations exist, and why they were unavoidable. Here's a template. This limitation arose because, and then explain the reason the limitation exists. Here's an example that leads on from the stated limitation that the cohort was predominantly white collar. This decision was made early on and seen as a benefit because a significant amount of new generative AI tools are being implemented in apps for white collar professionals such as marketing, design, and ad technology employees. So this example is explaining why the limitation exists. Next, show the consequence of this limitation. You could ask yourself here, what does it mean that this limitation exists in the study, and were there negative consequences? Here's a template. This limitation meant that negative consequence. Here's an example. These limitations meant that the findings were somewhat homogeneous, and while helping to achieve depth within that interesting homogeneous cohort, excluded some millennial voices from the discussion. So that's a pretty academic way of saying that the findings are only relevant to white-collar millennials and may not be relevant to blue-collar professionals. Finally, repeat for all of your limitations. Again, make sure that you cover multiple limitations, not just one, to demonstrate depth of knowledge and understanding of your topic. That brings us to an end of section 5.5, Limitations of the Study. In this section, you should have provided an orientation that outlined all of your key limitations, named each limitation and explained each limitation in detail, and shown the consequences of each limitation.
Section 5.6 outlines future research possibilities. In this section, recommend ideas for future studies that could build upon or fill the gaps identified within the limitations discussion in the previous step. This section has 4 steps. First, an orientation. Second, suggest a future research idea. Third, explain and justify the suggestion. And fourth, repeat for all future research recommendations that you have. Starting with the orientation, signpost your future research ideas to orient the reader so that they know all the ideas that you will cover in this section from the very beginning. Here's a template. Future research can build on the progress made by this study by Research Idea 1, Research Idea 2, and Research Idea 3. Here's an example. Future research can build upon the progress of this study by exploring long-term identity shifts as generative AI use in the workplace increases, exploring organizational responses to AI identity threat, and comparing AI threat and anxiety levels at different career stages. Next, zoom in on one of those research ideas and begin to explain it. Here's a template. The first idea for future research is, and name and explain the idea. Here's an example. One idea for future research is exploring organizational responses to generative AI identity threat. Next, highlight and justify the reasons for this research idea. Here, state that this potential line of inquiry was outside the scope of your study, but you still consider it to be a useful research idea that could build upon what you have done in your own work. Here's a template. It was identified that, and then name an interesting aspect of the topic that was outside the scope of your study. As such, a study that looks at the interesting aspects could add further insights to this topic. Here's an example. It was identified in this study that the research participants were disconnected with organizational attitudes towards generative AI implementation. As such, a study that looks at the perspectives of organizational leadership or considers organizational policy documents as part of a document analysis could add insights from perspectives that were not within the scope of this study. Lastly, repeat these steps for all future research ideas, remembering that you should have multiple ideas to show depth. That brings us to an end to section 5.6 on future research. In this section, you should have provided an orientation outlining future research suggestions, presented your suggestions, and explained and justified the reasons for each suggestion. Section 5.7 is the final conclusion to the entire thesis. This is your very last chance to leave a good impression. Try to focus on emphasizing how valuable or important your work is. This section has 3 steps. First, summarize the thesis and its key findings. Second, emphasize the value of the study. Third, end with a strong forward-looking statement. Starting with summarizing the thesis and findings, this is an elevator pitch opportunity. In other words, consider how you would explain your study if you only had 20 seconds to do so. This summary should be short and impactful, but brief. Here's a template. Overall, this thesis has found that, and then insert your elevator pitch of your findings, which could be as little as a paragraph, outlining what the key findings of the study are. Here's an example. Overall, this thesis has found that millennials experience AI identity threat, AI anxiety, despair, and disillusionment when considering the role of generative AI in their workplaces. The second step is to emphasize the value of the study. Here, make a statement about why your study was worthwhile to conduct. Here's a template. These findings have valuable insights for, and then incite the people who would find it valuable, and demonstrate the importance of, and then summarize your recommendations. Here's an example. These findings have valuable insights for both millennials in the workplace who require support to move through the generative AI transition and the organizations in which they work, which need to manage change through sensitive practices and policies. Finally, end with a strong forward-looking statement that looks ahead at the implications of this study for either policy, practice, or future research. Here's a template. Looking forward, this research opens up the door to policy, practice, or future studies. Here's an example. Looking ahead, this research opens the door to future research into how AI identity threat and anxiety manifest in millennials and mid-career professionals. That brings us to an end to section 5.7 of the conclusion. In this section, you should have summarized the thesis and key findings in an elevator pitch, emphasize the value of the study, and ended with a strong forward-looking statement. And that brings us to the very end of the thesis. Don't forget, you can grab any of those additional thesis writing resources, and there are dozens of them for any time that you find yourself stuck in your thesis. Just download the thesis template linked in the description, and in that email, there will be instructions on how to grab all of those additional resources, including cheat sheets and AI prompts. And if you made it this far in this video, thanks for watching. Good luck in your thesis, and leave a comment in the description to tell me that you watched the whole thing.